I become convinced that 9/11 was a sham. It was a put-up job. It was a staged event. The whole thing was phony from beginning to end. Everything the government has told us about 9/11, virtually without exception, is false. Now I'm going to do my best to justify that characterization using evidence that's in the public domain, but by analyzing it using expertise that is not. And I'm very grateful to Mel for inviting me here. I have been flown around the world. I was flown in 2006 to Athens with my wife, all expense paid, to be put on television for 3.5 hours. It was broadcast worldwide by satellite. In 2007, I organized the first national conference for scholars for 9/11 Truth in Madison, the science and politics of 9/11. In 2008, I was flown to Buenos Aires to give 3 lectures on JFK and 1 on 9/11. There were 7 stories in the newspaper there, not little stories, quarter page or half page with photographs. Telem, which is the national news service of the Republic of Argentina, normally publishes only a little paragraph. They gave me 2 full page articles. Plus, I was put on television for 20 minutes during an interview that was broadcast all over South America. In 2009, I was flown back to Buenos Aires for an event on 9/11/2009, held at the National Library of the Republic of Argentina, where I was a principal speaker. We had 200 people, 7 or 8 TV cameras, and I addressed the very issues I'm going to be addressing with you now. In 2010, I organized a symposium in London, debunking the war on terror, and in collusion with Kevin Barrett, who's a co-founder of Muslims for 9/11 Truth, and Gillett Otzman, who's a celebrated jazz clarinetist, but also an outspoken critic of what's called identity politics, were my co-speakers, and it was hosted, our event was at Friend's house opposite Euston Station, perhaps the best venue in London. And it was hosted by Ken O'Keefe, who was the hero of the Freedom Flotilla. This guy disarmed 2 of those Israeli commandos when they came down aboard the ship, and his face covered with blood was broadcast all over the world. He was our master of ceremonies. So when the Itasca 9/11 Truth and Justice Committee contacted me, I thought, what could be more appropriate than come up to Duluth and share with you what we have been able to find through this collaborative research, in which I profoundly believe, because none of us have enough expertise to cover all the different areas that are involved here. Now, the bottom line that I'm going to seek to explain to you today is that the crashes, the alleged plane crashes, are the key. That there are ample indications that they were fabricated or faked one way or another, some in more subtle fashion than the others. So we're going to begin with some video clips that relate to what was broadcast on 9/11. Now, the first clip begins with the interruption of MASH. What could be more appropriate than that? They have a news flash. They take it from MASH, and all of a sudden you're in New York. Now listen carefully. You got a guy there who was on the scene who says, a bomb, it was a bomb, down a plane, a bomb. And the guy says, the reporter says, yeah, well, we saw the plane on television, okay? Listen to Jamie McIntyre. He's out there at the Pentagon, and he's being asked by his anchor. The anchor says, well, tell us about this plane crash. And Jamie says, well, you may think a plane crashed there, but from my up-close inspection, there's no indication that any plane crashed there. And then we're taken out to Shanksville. And this guy is, questioning a reporter, one of the first on the scene, and there's another who gives an identical report. And what's he say? Well, there's a hole in the ground, but there's no indication that any plane crashed there. Think about it. These guys were there. Listen to what they have to say.
No second plane. It was a bomb. Bombed in the building, not second plane. It was a bomb. Who said the second plane?
That's what we're told, the second plane.
No,
we saw it on television.
I saw everything.
All right, well, thanks a lot. This is...
idea of how much of the plane actually impacted the building.
It might have appeared that way, but from my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only site is the actual side of the building that's crashed in. And as I said, the only pieces left that you can see are small enough that you could pick up in your hand. There are no large tail sections, wing sections, a fuselage, nothing like that anywhere around, which would indicate that the entire plane crashed into the side of the Pentagon and then caused the side to collapse. Now, even though if you look at the pictures of the Pentagon, you see that the floors have all collapsed, that didn't happen immediately. It wasn't until almost about 45 minutes later that the structure was weakened enough that all of the floors collapsed.
Jeff, it's a United Airlines plane, it's believed to be at that site outside Pittsburgh, isn't it?
That's exactly right, John, with 45 people total on board. And one of the more profound things today, the imprint of terrorism seared not only on Wall Street, but also on Main Street. Here you have an area 80 miles to the southeast of Pittsburgh, and this plane, which went down at about 10 o'clock this morning. We have rescue vehicles that came in earlier in the day, and they have turned up nothing. No one believed to be alive from this crash. Some of the media just getting back to the scene, which is about a quarter of a mile up on a hill back behind me, and so some of the first pictures just starting to come in within the last hour. I want to get quickly to Chris Kanicki. He's a photographer with the Pittsburgh affiliate of Fox affiliate. He was back there just a couple of minutes ago, and Chris, I've seen the pictures. It looks like there's nothing there except for a hole in the ground.
Basically, that's right. The only thing you could see from where we were was a big gouge in the earth and some broken trees. We could see some people walking around in the area, but from where we could see, there wasn't much left.
Any large pieces of debris at all?
No, there was nothing that you could distinguish that a plane had crashed there.
Smoke, fire?
Nothing. It was absolutely quiet. It was actually very quiet. Nothing going on down there, no smoke, no fire, just a couple of people walking around. They look like part of the NTSB crew walking around looking at the pieces.
How big would you say that hole was?
From my estimates, I would guess it was probably about 20 to 15 feet long and probably about 10 feet long or 10 feet wide.
What could you see on the ground, if anything, other than dirt and ash? And
you couldn't see anything. You could just see dirt, ash, and people walking around, broken trees.
Says that City Hall in Oakland will remain open. It will be business as usual. He is urging people to remain calm. Given what is going on, remain calm. Oakland City Hall will remain open, but in San Francisco, City Hall has been closed. We're also just getting word here now that a second United Airlines jet, Flight 175, from Boston to Los Angeles, is now missing. Again, if you're just joining us, there have been 4 separate plane crashes. 3 of those planes were en route to California. 2 were heading to LAX. The 3rd was heading to San Francisco International Airport.
That was specifically the one heading to SFO, United Flight number 93 from Newark to SFO. It apparently crashed in Pennsylvania, fairly close to the border of Maryland and not too far from Camp David. Why is that significant? Because one of the groups possibly claiming responsibility for all these terrorist attacks is the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and it was this week in 1978 that the Camp David Accords were reached. Is there a connection? At this point, we don't know, but it is important to be aware of that situation. In Washington, D.C., many congressional leaders have been transferred to a secret location. Some senators have described this as a second Pearl Harbor. And President Bush was in Florida this morning, but he made a brief announcement when the first attacks were clear on the World Trade Center, and he was heading back to Washington, D.C. At this point, we don't know exactly where he is. They're not really broadcasting that information, but we are told that the president is safe right now.
We're waiting for a press conference to start in San Francisco from the Office of Emergency Services.
175 hitting the South Tower. Watch this. Just watch this and see if anything strikes you as remotely odd about the impact of this plane to this building. You'll see it twice. This is the Michael Hezarkhani video. I'm going to say quite a lot about these as I proceed, so I just want you to see the footage that was broadcast on television that day. Here's another. Remarkably enough, there was a fellow right at the base of the South Tower.
But for Evan Fairbanks, this is the image that will haunt him and us for the rest of our lives.
The image of that flame just coming out of nowhere, coming into the frame and disappearing into the side, into the south side of the tower, as if a floor had been hollowed out and it was a hangar that it was just laying in. We've seen these images in movies and we know that it's all artificial and Hollywood makes it. And it's hard to put together that it's real this time.
He actually says in the more extended interview that it looks like a bad special effect. Well, that has particular significance, as I'm going to explain. Now, Twin Towers were two magnificent structures. They had a special tube within a tube design I'm going to elaborate upon. Construction began in 1966, occupancy in 1970. They were 110-story buildings. They received many awards for their design. Now, the idea was to have an inner core with 47 massive core columns to provide support for 240 external support columns and leave this creative, all this open office space, okay, all around. This was extremely novel at the time, though it's been widely emulated ever since. And then there were these steel trusses that connected the core columns to the external support columns that were filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete. Now, the steel was tapered. At the base and the sub-basement, it was 6 inches thick, then 5, 4, 3, so by the time you got to the top, it was very thin, like a 1/4 inch thick at the top, which was one of the reasons why the theory that the buildings collapsed turns out to be a physical impossibility, as I shall explain. There were actually 7 buildings in the World Trade Center complex. Here you can see the outlines of the two massive 110-story North and South Tower. And then not far from the North Tower was a 47-story building called the World Trade Center 7. That would have been the largest building in 32 states. Had it not been surrounded by those two enormous buildings, it would have been very striking on its own. Here's Philip Zelikow, who had become the executive director of the 9/11 Commission report. Philip Zelikow not only came from the inner sanctum of the Bush administration, he oversaw the transition of the national security apparatus from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration. He co-authored a book with Condoleezza Rice. He had also co-authored an article in Foreign Affairs called about catastrophic terrorism and what would have happened if the attack on the World Trade Center in 1993 had been successful. He described it as like day and night, that there'd be a before and after, that draconian measures might take place afterwards, the loss of civil liberties, and who knows what else, but it would have been quite a stunning difference. This man has his academic background, and I was astonished to discover this, in the creation and maintenance of public myths. Public myths. He actually drafted the 9/11 report a year before he shared its contents with any members of the staff. So if you think that this was in response to an extensive investigation, I'm sorry to say that you are mistaken. Now, there just happened to be a French film crew in a highly improbable location in New York, where the cameraman could swing his camera up and actually catch the hit on the North Tower. It's important to realize this was not broadcast on 9/11. It was not broadcast on 9/11. Leslie Raphael, who is a Scottish student of 9/11, has discovered about 100 improbable coincidences that had to be satisfied to find a location in New York where a cameraman could simply pan up and catch what was going on here. And if you try to look, you know, it's pretty difficult to see exactly what's going on here. I mean, you have, you know, you've got a cloud of debris or smoke here. This is something like the entry. There's something getting close. It's very obscure what's going on here. So if you slow it down, I mean, this is what it should have looked like if a Boeing 767 was involved. Now, a 767, there were 2 in New York. The 2 hits in New York both involved 767s. They hit in Shanksville, the alleged crash in Shanksville, and at the Pentagon were 757s. And this may be to keep things straight in the minds of those who were plotting these events. But here's what it ought to have looked like if you had a 767, okay? The building's 208 feet across, and the 767 has a wingspan that's around 156 feet. So it should cover a lot. This is what you actually get when you do a time sequence. Do you see a Boeing 767? There's a sequence of images here, but it's very obscure and difficult to sort out what it is. It's a flying something. One student, Rosalie Grable, who did this time sequence, has referred to them as flying whatsits, just to indicate that it's very hard to tell. There was this enormous smoke, and after the smoke and explosion cleared, you had this cutout in the building. But it's interesting that the cutout has kind of a flattened V shape, whereas the impact, as close as you can get to it, has this very distorted, kind of like an elongated Z shape. And it looks as though the smoke and the obfuscation was an opportunity to create this kind of cutout. In fact, later on, there was an extension here, shown in the circle, that wasn't present in the beginning. So it looks as though there was an effort made to make it look more like a cartoon cutout. I mean, you have to go back to Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons to find a precedent for this, where, you know, Wile E. Coyote would race through a boulder and you'd have a perfect silhouette of a coyote. Well, if a plane had hit this building, you would not get a perfect silhouette of a plane, and yet that's what they gave us, a perfect silhouette of a plane. Here is 175. We see that from the Hezarkhani footage, you have the plane approaching the building. Now, it's fascinating that multiple sources, the Royal Air Force, the FAA, the U.S. Marine Corps, have calculated the flight of this plane at 160 miles an hour. Now, it's interesting that this 160 miles an hour happens to be the cruising speed of a 767 at 35,000 feet. Now, air gets more tenuous the higher the altitude. At 700 to 1,000 feet, which is what is going on here, the air is 3 times more dense than it is at 35,000 feet. The turbines can't suck the air through the engines fast enough to allow it to fly 560 miles an hour and begin functioning as brakes. A very detailed analysis of why this is an impossible speed has been given by John Lear, for example, the son of the designer of the Learjet, who holds 16 world speed records and is qualified in every area of airplane maintenance. Notice here, if you did a frame-by-frame advance, you find the plane is halfway into the building. And look what's so interesting. It's halfway into the building. You don't see any signs of any damage to the building. You don't have the wings breaking off. You don't have the tail breaking off. You don't have bodies, seats, or luggage falling to the ground. And that's quite startling, because this plane is approaching this building at an angle and intersecting with 8 different floors. Remember those steel trusses connected to the core columns at one end, external column with 4 to 8 inches of concrete? Each one of those floors represents an acre of concrete. This is intersecting with 8 different floors. You can count them, 8 different floors. That's a huge amount of resistance. And we all know by Newton's laws of motion, okay, that you're going to have an equal and opposite reaction. In other words, this plane flying at an alleged 560 miles an hour into this building, which weighs 500,000 tons, and is stationary, would have the same effect if the plane were stationary and the building weighing 500,000 tons were to hit it. When people resist the consequence here, namely that we're watching an impossible entry into the building in violation of Newton's law, they try to suggest, well, maybe it was a special plane. But the fact is, no plane could make an entry into this building with its intricate lattice structure, providing this massive resistance without crumpling. The aluminum would have crumpled, the wings broken off, body seats, luggage fall to the ground, none of which happened. You're even there with Evan Fairbanks looking straight up at the plane. Zoop, it's gone. It just goes into the building. In fact, we have studied both the Hezarkhani and the Evan Fairbanks videos and discovered that the plane passes its entire length into the building in the same number of frames it passes its entire length through air. Which means that this massive 500,000 ton building provides no more resistance to the path of this plane than air, which is such an obvious physical impossibility that I cannot imagine anyone, once they understand that point, could possibly imagine that what we're seeing is a real plane entering a real building. Now, I'll explain why they had to do this, but I'll tell you the evidence is convincing. In fact, I find it irrefutable because we're talking about events that violates laws of aerodynamics with the impossible speed, laws of physics, and laws of engineering, and you know, the same number of frames. Now, notice this, here's a real oddity too, and this was also broadcast live. The nose seems to poke out of the plane. Notice it's already in the building, there's no explosion take place. Notice how fascinating this is. It's entered over here, it's gone into the building completely, and its nose is poking out. Would you believe that during the television broadcast, when the nose poked out, that the networks went to black? They went to black. They blackened their screen. And when they came back on, they used their logo to conceal the fact that the nose had come out. Now, the nose of a commercial airline like this is the most fragile part. It's filled with sensitive electronics. This is not possible with a real plane. And of course, we had the spectacular fireballs. And those spectacular fireballs are going to be very important, as I'm going to explain, because we have been told that it was a jet fuel that burned so hot that it causes the steel to weaken or melt and cause the building to collapse. That's what we've been told. That's the official story. Just to recall the elements, 19 Islamic hijackers are alleged to have hijacked these 4 commercial carriers. They're supposed to have outfoxed the most sophisticated air defense system in the world. They're supposed to have committed these atrocities under the control of a guy off in a cave in Afghanistan, right? That's the bare bones. Elias Davidson, a scholar in Germany, has established the government has never been able to place the hijackers aboard any of those planes. And as some of you may be aware, 6 or 7 of them turned up alive and well afterwards. Even Mohammed Atta, who was supposed to be the head of this terrorist squad, called his father, according to his father, who reported he told him that he was alive and well, but he was petrified. He was scared for his life, which was a very reasonable position to be in. Now, David Ray Griffin has studied, who may be the leading expert on 9/11, has studied the phone calls. There were some 19 phone calls or more that were allegedly made, and has discovered all of those phone calls were fake. All of those phone calls were fake. Even the phone call that was reported by Ted Olson, who was our former Solicitor General, who used to represent the Bush administration between the Supreme Court, who alleged to have more than one phone call from his wife Barbara, who was a prominent right-wing spokeswoman on television, revised his story about the phone calls 3 times. Because it turns out that a professor of computer science from Western Ontario took 3 different types of cell phones. He'd flown around all over the country. He discovered at speeds above 200 miles an hour or altitudes above 2,000, they don't function. The principal problem is microwave relay towers can't switch the phone call from one tower to another fast enough under those conditions. He also claimed that she had used the airphone when he gave up on the cell phone, that it was a cell phone call. He claimed, well, she'd used the airphone call, which required a credit card. You know, and she was calling him to tell him that the hijackers had heard them all in the back of the plane, which is a pretty odd thing, I would think, in terms of weight distribution to begin with. But it turns out that those planes, this was a 757 because she was supposed to be on Flight 77 and hit the Pentagon, allegedly, there were no airphones on those planes in 2001. So we're getting the Solicitor General of all people giving us a phony story. In fact, the FBI has confirmed that there was no contact between Barbara Olson and her husband Ted. The FBI, that's our own FBI, has confirmed that there was no phone call completed between Barbara Olson and her husband Ted. In addition, John Lear, whom I mentioned already, has observed that before a pilot can pull away from a terminal, he must submit an envelope. The envelope consists of a flight checklist, a flight plan, and a passenger list or a passenger manifest, a list of all the passengers. None of those envelopes has ever been produced by the government. Not only that, but Colonel George Nelson, a U.S. Air Force air crash investigator, has observed that of the millions of uniquely identifiable component parts from these 4 aircraft, the government has yet to produce even one. Any of you who are familiar with the passenger manifest that CNN would publish almost immediately know that there was no name of any Arabic person, much less any name of any of these alleged hijackers on those manifests. Now, there has been an attempt to distort that by saying those were lists of the victims. But how would the airlines know who was hijacking, who was a victim? If the hijackers were passengers, they should be on the passenger manifest. They're not on the passenger manifest. I participated in a debate with a guy named Mark Roberts, who's famous for trying to defend the government's official position. This was on television, on an interview in a debate on a show called Hardfire. You can find it online. And at one point, he pulled out a passenger manifest and said, well, there are the names. And I looked, and they'd be written in hand at the top and the bottom of the manifest. I mean, it was an obvious fabrication. So, I dismiss it. I mean, this is ridiculous. And I actually have right with me here, in my computer case, FAA registry records that show that 2 of the flights were not deregistered until 2002, and even more strikingly, the other 2 not until 2005. Which implies that those planes were around and flying long after the alleged events that we're discussing. Here's the opening now. You see here, in the midst of those fireballs, they appear to have blown out openings here to create a simulation of a plane having crashed through. They also found an engine. An engine component was found at the intersection of Church and Murray. And that's often been cited as proof positive that a plane hit the South Tower. In fact, there's some footage that you see something that's supposed to look like some flying heavy object running out of the building, right? I mean, look, the windows were only 18 inches wide. The architect who designed them had a fear of heights. I mean, this is fascinating. He made the windows only 18 inches wide, and they're set within frames. Space between the support columns, the steel support columns, was 1 meter. A meter is about 10% more than a yard, right? So we're talking about 18 inches being less than half of the space between the support columns. And of course, there were no windows between different floors, which means that more than half of the building had no windows. More than half of the building had no windows. So if you're talking a plane hitting the building, and talking about all the parts going through the windows, well, that was not only improbable, but most of the plane would not have passed through those little windows, or the parts of the building that didn't have windows, except the engines. So it is plausible to claim that an engine might have been found, and here at the corner of Church and Murray, there was such an engine part. Now, it has been determined that this part did not come from a 767, so it's the wrong kind of engine. Not only that, but Fox News was there and discovered there was a van where individuals with FBI vests were unloading something heavy. One apologist to the government says, well, how do you know they weren't picking it up? And I say, well, it's obvious because it was there later. Okay? So Fox News really did us a benefit here. They actually caught these guys in FBI vests, who I presume were indeed FBI agents, planting this part of an engine, except the engine is the wrong type of engine for the type of plane. It's under a building scaffolding. You can't see it here. Not only is the scaffolding undamaged, but the sidewalk, which would have been massively shattered had the heavy object hit it from that distance, is perfectly intact and normal. So we have here, see, it's a Hollywood-style prop. We have a prop here. Now, this is Frank DiMartini, who was a project manager, explained that the buildings were designed to withstand the impact of the then largest commercial carriers, which were Boeing 707s. He said the intricate lattice structure was such that the building could have sustained multiple hits by the then largest commercial carriers, and its integrity would not have been threatened. There would be local damage, but its integrity would not have been threatened. So I compare the 707 with the 767, and they turn out to be very comparable in their mass and their fuel capacity. And actually, the cruising speed of the 707 is even greater than the cruising speed of the 767. Shown here is 530, though in the videos it's 560. Which means that if they had both hit at their cruising speed, more damage would have been done by a 707, which the buildings were designed to withstand. George Bush was in Booker Elementary School in Bradenton, Florida. My wife and I and our daughter lived in Bradenton, Florida for 5 years. I know Booker's school. He was engaged in a classroom with elementary children when Andy Card came in to tell him that the second hit had occurred and America was under attack. his expression did not change one iota. He remained sitting in the classroom with a book about a little girl and her pet goat. For 7 minutes, he didn't excuse himself. And get this, later on, he would on 2 different public occasions say, when I saw that pilot hit the first tower, he said, I thought to myself, what a terrible pilot. Well, it was about 25 minutes between the first hit and the second hit. Once the second hit occurs, you know, this isn't a terrible pilot. I mean, you got Andy Card telling him America's under attack. The only time he could have had such a thought was if he actually was watching it on television when it wasn't broadcast on television publicly. But I'm convinced he was actually watching it on closed Secret Service television network. And because George W. Bush was not that bright, he made a remark that was too revealing about that terrible pilot. There was only that one period of time anyone could have had such a thought. He said it twice, and he added, obviously the TV was on. But of course, this wasn't covered by the public. It wasn't broadcast that day. Now here's why they had to resort to fakery. There was an enormous explosion in the sub-basements of both of the buildings. Here you see some smoke coming from it. It did damage to the lobby. 2 students of 9/11, Craig Furlong and Gordon Ross, one is an engineer, one's a numerical analyst, heard the story from William Rodriguez, who was the senior custodian in the North Tower, who reported an enormous explosion in the sub-basement prior to any reverberations from above. And they followed it up, and they discovered that Columbia University had been maintaining, has a seismic laboratory, very specific times from the explosion. They got 0.7 and 0.9 on the Richter scale from the explosion, which is, you know, right next to the bedrock, because these things were connected to the bedrock. And they got FAA and radar data from the U.S. Air Force and so forth, and they found there was a 14-second difference that the explosion occurred in the North Tower 14 seconds before Flight 11 allegedly hit, and in the South Tower 17 seconds. Now, what's going on here? According to the government, these explosions in the sub-basements were because of jet fuel falling through the elevator shafts into the sub-basement, okay? Now, there are 3 problems here. Number 1 is that the elevator shafts in these buildings are staggered. You could go down 30 floors, you'd have to get off, go down 30 floors, get off, go down 30 more floors, okay? There are 2 elevator shafts go up and down. One of Willie's friends, a fellow custodian, was in one of the elevator shafts in the North Tower. He survived. He would have been roasted, dry roasted, if this fuel had fallen down that elevator shaft. And then, of course, there was a timing problem, the 14 and 17 second. So what they were doing was fabricating an explanation for these explosions in the sub-basement that were set off by independent demolitions that had nothing to do with the plane. But they had to have an explanation that the public might buy. And there were several reasons why they had to resort to fakery. One is, it's very difficult to hit a 208-foot wide target with a commercial plane flying at high speed. A couple dozen members of Pilots for 9/11 Truth tried to do it. Only one of them, Rob Balsamo, who actually founded the organization, was able to do it maybe 1 time in 10. Well, what kind of explanation are you going to have for the explosion in the sub-basement if it misses hitting the tower, right? Then there's no jet fuel falling through the elevator shafts. Here's the second reason they had to fake it. They had to get the plane inside the building. Why did they have to do that? Well, suppose what had happened was real. If it had actually hit, when you got those 8 floors of horizontal resistance, the plane would have crumpled, the wings broken off the tail, body seats, luggage. It wouldn't have gone into the building, which means that there wouldn't have been any plausible reasons why the buildings could have collapsed. They had to get the plane into the building to have an explosion that could later be cited to be the purported reason why the buildings collapsed, and also the explanation for the explosions in the sub-basement. They didn't get it quite right, but that is what they were attempting to do. Now, you notice for the North Tower, you got the Flying What's-It. We're not quite sure what it was, that was flying toward the building. Rosalie has speculated it might have been 3 unmanned aerial vehicles, and when you look at that funny Z-like, you know, from the impact, there might have even been 4. Something was there. A fellow named Anthony Lawson, who's a critic of any theory of video fakery, and he's in the film industry and has expertise, said, well, if this was staged, if the Naudet brothers filming of the hit of Flight 11 on the North Tower was staged, why was it out of focus? And I explained to him, I said, Anthony, it had to be out of focus because it wasn't a 767. If it had been in focus, you would have known it wasn't a 767. So being out of focus was part of the ploy. But as I say, Leslie Raphael has found like 100 circumstances that are improbable. You got to figure out the improbability of each one of these for that film crew to have been right where it was. New York has all these tall buildings. There are very few locations where you'd be able to have caught this event, which allegedly, of course, was happening spontaneously and all that. Far, far from it. So they had a plan, but it didn't work. Now here's some firefighters. They were reporting hearing explosions in the building. Any of you who've ever seen this first sensational film about 9/11 called Loose Change? You got this one firefighter says it was like boom, 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 boom. Well, think about this. According to the 9/11 Commission, the official report says those 2 buildings collapsed in 10 seconds apiece. They say one 9, the other 11. Well, they're 110 stories high, right? There's an oddity about the collapse of the second tower, or the south tower, which was hit second but collapsed first because the top 34 start to tilt. I'll talk about that. But if you talk about this boom, 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 to do that in 10 seconds, I'm thinking each of those booms is probably talking about blowing up 10 floors at a time, because if you're blowing up 10 floors at a time, about a second per each 10 floor at a time blow up, you get about 10 seconds. So it's got to be on that order in terms of what was going on to destroy the buildings, as I'll explain. Here's that top 30 floors. What happened here? Well, some funny thing happened. This is at the 80th floor. Okay, the plane that hit the South Tower allegedly was on the 80th floor. There turned out to be several oddities about the 80th floor. But you get this tilting of the floors. Now you would think that would keep tilting and it would come down into a huge volume of mass, you know, of steel and concrete and all that. But it didn't. In fact, all of a sudden the whole thing starts to go up, and you see it's still on the tilt, but now it's being converted into very fine dust. In fact, what we find with both of these buildings is from the top down, they're being converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust. Some parts, some components, some steel components weighing hundreds of tons are being blasted outward. Well, how could that happen? Think about that. How could that happen if it's because of the fires and the planes and the melting the steel and it's all collapsing? What would throw massive steel assemblies hundreds of yards outward so they're impaled on other buildings? What could do that? There was nothing about the official account that could do that. Thus, Paul Craig Roberts, who's one of our country's most notable public intellectuals, and as a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, observed, and he's a man who knows about these things, there was a massive energy deficit here. There wasn't enough energy to account for what happened to the Twin Towers on the official account. This has always been a problem for the government. Here, look at that. Does that look like a collapse to you? I just say, is that a collapse? Is that a collapse? Think of what a collapse would look like. You have been told by your government this building's collapsed. You could go out and you could ask 100 citizens of Duluth, and 99 of them are going to tell you that the building collapsed. Is that a collapse? Is that a collapse? Now I got this wonderful retired high school physics, chemistry, math instructor who did a calculation with regard to the North Tower. And remember how I explained the steel got thinner and thinner and thinner? It turns out that the plane there hit about the 96th floor, but it's also at an angle. It's intersecting with 7 different floors, not 8 as in the case of the South. If you take from the 96th floor up, that top 14 floors, the mass of the steel, because it's thinner, remember 6, 5, 4 at the bottom, etc., up to 1/4 inch, it's so much thinner that it represents only 1.4% of the mass of the steel. Now, do you imagine 1.4% of the mass of the steel is going to overwhelm 98.6% of the mass of the steel? John Skilling, who was an engineer involved in the design here, said it was built with a safety factor of 20. What that means is every floor, which obviously is designed to carry every floor above it, could actually carry 20 times that number of floors. 20 times that number of floors. So you got a floor that's actually supporting 100 floors, it could support 20 times that number of 100, which is 2,000. In other words, these are massively robust buildings, okay? There's no possible way they could have been subject to a physical collapse. And just think about this. Below the 80th floor in the South Tower and the 94th in the North, those buildings were stone cold steel. Stone cold steel. They still had their carrying capacity. They still had a safety factor at 20. It's preposterous to suppose that a collapse could have occurred here. It was a physical impossibility, and yet that's what the government has asked you and me to believe. This is a calculation of Chuck in which he determined that the carrying capacity of the lower floors in the North Tower was 199%. If you said the weight or the mass of the top was 1, and you had 199 opposing it, another form of proof. Now here you got the North Tower, and you can tell it's the North because it has the antenna. And I haven't explored this, but I have recently encountered the suggestion that the antenna was actually installed there to be a part of the mechanics, the causal process to destroy the building. So here you got it going down in about 10 seconds, okay? Look at that. And of course, you know, when it's done, I mean, it's gone. I mean, that building is gone. I'm going to explain why they had to use a novel method of destroying these buildings. These were not classic controlled demolition. Now here is a collapse theory. This is a diagram from Judy Wood, who is a professor of mechanical engineering in Clemson. Here's a collapse theory, right? You've got one floor collapsing on another. Think of it in the old 45 player, or a 33 if you want. And just think of the records collapsing, right? But what would you still have standing? Well, you still have the spindle. You'd still have the spindle. Notice there's no spindle here from what we've been viewing, right? Go back there. Where's the spindle? No spindle. No spindle. There's something there. We'll come back to that, but it's just a fragment. And then you'd have a stack of pancakes, okay? You'd have a stack of the floors left. In fact, we find that in Building 7. Building 7 wasn't destroyed until 5:20 in the afternoon. It was 47 stories. We find from experiments with controlled demolition, based on past experience, if you destroy a building, a structure, you can have a debris pile about 12% of the original. 12% of 47 stories would be 4.7 plus another 2%, you got about 5.5 floors. We had that at Building 7, I'll show you. But in the North and South Tower, we had nothing. This is a pancake collapse. Okay, Pakistan, right, they have these concrete slab structures which are typical. No steel structure high-rise, by the way, has ever collapsed due to fire before 9/11. No steel structure high-rise has ever collapsed due to fire after 9/11. And as our research has shown, no steel structure high-rise collapsed due to fire on 9/11. But this is what a pancake collapse would look like. Now here's the alternative. Judy is engaged in comparing biological or natural structures with artificial man-made structures. And the way she has described it is it's as though you had two enormous trees that were turning to sawdust from the top down. Okay, turning to sawdust from the top down. I'll explain another significant difference between Building 7 and the Twin Towers. In the Twin Towers, all the floors remain stationary, waiting their turn to be blown to kingdom come, in the memorable phrase of Morgan Reynolds. But in the Building 7, all the floors fall at the same time. They all fall at the same time. Not in the North and the South Tower. They're all stationary. They all wait their turn. Building 7, they all go at the same time. Typical of a classic controlled demolition. So what was going on in the North and South Tower was something quite different. When it was all done, Father Frank Morales, who was a first responder from St. Mark's Episcopal Church in the vicinity, came on my then radio show. I now have my 4th radio show. But then when I had Father Frank on twice, 2 different times, he explained the buildings were destroyed below ground level. Below ground level. You should have had, if it was a collapse, 12% of 110 floors. which would be 11 floors plus a few more. So you should have 14 or 15 floors, but they were destroyed below ground level. So something very strange was going on. Here's the North Tower, just to see it again. Look at that. 10 seconds. Now, Judy also calculated how long it would take if you just dropped a bowling ball from the top of one of these towers under, free fall conditions. Here we're assuming a vacuum because we're using Galileo's law of free fall. The distance fallen equals 1/2 the gravitational constant times time squared, which means as it falls faster and faster. Okay, so first second 1 unit, but the second second 4 units, the third second 9 units, and all that. Okay, and it would take 9.22 seconds. 9.22 seconds for a bowling ball dropped with nothing between it and the ground to hit the ground. 9.22 seconds, nothing between it and the ground. And yet we're talking about buildings that collapsed that were destroyed in 10 seconds. And yet there were, 80 stone cold steel in the south and 94 stone cold steel in the north. What's going on here? Something's fraudulent. Suppose you had a collapse and a floor of pancakes hits the next floor, pancakes hits the next floor, pancakes hit the next floor. Even if you assume it was instantaneous, okay, the one falls and then another falls and another falls, but it's instant, right? You lose that time squared benefit. And then if you calculate the amount of time it would take, it would have been 96.7 seconds. Now, it's fascinating that Underwriters Laboratory certified the steel used in the North and the South Tower to 2,000 degrees for 3 to 4 hours without suffering any harm at all, without weakening, without melting. No problem, 3 to 4 hours at 2,000 degrees. Well, the National Institute of Standards and Technology studied 236 samples of steel from the towers. And they found 233 had not been exposed to temperatures above 500 degrees. 500 degrees. And the other 3 not above 1,200 degrees. Well, obviously a fire could have burned at 500 degrees, which happens to be the temperature of an ordinary office fire forever, and not cause the building to weaken, much less collapse, okay? And it just so happens that while we can't reconstruct the buildings to test Underwriters Laboratory certification, in 1975 that happened for us. There was a fire in the North Tower on the 13th floor. It burned intensely for 3 or 4 hours at 2,000 degrees. And when it was over, they didn't have to replace any of the steel. In fact, this was when they installed the sprinkler system. And let me tell you the reason why they had to have that explosion in the sub-basements that Willie Rodriguez described. He came to Madison, where I now live, and gave a talk about his experience. And when we went to dinner afterwards, he told me about watching the water fill up in the sub-basement. And I realized then they were draining the sprinkler system. If they hadn't drained the sprinkler system, it would extinguish these very modest fires, and they would have had a pseudo-explanation for why the building collapsed. And as you already know now, the building didn't collapse. But they have conveyed that impression to the American public. And this is called lying through your teeth. Okay? It's phony, it's rubbish. It's not even possible that these buildings could have collapsed given their design and the conditions that were present. And in 1975, we actually had an empirical test, history did it for us, that vindicated the Underwriters Laboratory certification that the buildings could withstand 3 to 4 hours at 2,000 degrees. Now notice, not only has the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, certified that the fires weren't anywhere near that hot, but they only burned in the South Tower for about an hour and the North Tower about an hour and a half, which means that the fires did not burn hot enough nor long enough to cause any damage to the steel. It's a hoax. And look at that. Does that look like a collapse? Notice stuff is being blown upward, it's being blown outward, and when it's all done, this building is being converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust. And the reason why they had to do that is the key to understanding why they had to resort to this novel mode of demolition. Look at that. That's one of the most fascinating photographs of all 9/11. Look at that. And the government would have you believe there was a collapse in jet fuel-based fires. Jet fuel is made of kerosene. Sounds imposing, jet fuel. Jesse Ventura, our former governor, has a gift for making complex points in a simple way. He observes that propane burns hotter than kerosene, and yet his camping stove, which burns propane, doesn't melt when he uses it. Now watch this. Here's a remnant of the North Tower. Just watch this. Now, if you got a 500,000 ton building being converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust, then it would not be surprising that you might have footage showing a part of that 110-story building being converted into very fine dust. This is a remnant of the core columns of the North Tower being converted into dust. And there are efforts to deny it, to say, well, no, it was actually there, and it was covered with dust. So what you're seeing is the dust coming off of the steel, the remnant of the core column. But remember what Father Frank told us. They were reduced below ground level. So if this actually had survived, where is it? Because it wasn't there in the debris pile when it was all done. So why should we be surprised? You got two 500,000-ton buildings being converted mostly into very fine dust. Some parts are being blown off. Some very large assemblies of steel, for example, impacting in other buildings, requires a tremendous amount of energy. Why would we be surprised if we then find a part of the building which we can actually see being converted into very fine dust? I mean, in this case, if it's true of the whole, it must be true of the part. You may weigh, say, more than 100 pounds, and you may be made of cells, but that doesn't mean your cells weigh more than 100 pounds, right? So it's true of the whole is not always true of the part, but if a building is being decimated and converted into very fine dust, then its parts must be being converted into very fine dust. Look at that. Millions of cubic yards of dust was enveloping lower Manhattan. Look at that. Millions of cubic yards. Think of this poor fellow, right? He's got to clean it up with a shovel. He's got to clean it up with a shovel. I mean, imagine the enormity of the task. Plus, and this is fascinating, millions of pieces of paper were spread all over the city. Now, that's very, very odd. Something had the energy, the capacity to blow apart these two 500,000-ton buildings, convert them into very fine dust, and it didn't extinguish, blow up the paper? That's very odd. Now, it just so happens there were 5 young men who were in Liberty State Park, New Jersey, who were filming the destruction of the Twin Towers. And they were dressed in Arab garb, and they were celebrating, taking pictures of themselves while they did it. Neighbors found this very peculiar. So they called the police. The police apprehended them in a white van from a company known Urban Moving System, which turns out to be an Israeli front. When the police officer walked up to the driver turned to him and he said, "Hey, we're not your problem. Your problem is our problem. The Palestinians are the problem." Did any of you catch when you were listening to that footage that was being broadcast on 9/11 when the anchor said there's been a report that responsibility for them is that this has been taken by a Democratic Front for Palestine? Do you think Palestine had anything to do with this? Do you know that on 9/11 they played footage in relation to the destruction of Twin Towers that showed a bunch of Palestinians still celebrating and cheering, and most Americans thought the obvious thing, oh, they're celebrating and cheering because we're suffering from this attack? The Palestinians were just as stunned and silent as were most Americans. They were astonished that this was taking place. That footage had been taken from a religious celebration in the past and inserted for broadcast on American television one time, but it made an indelible impact, right? The Palestinians are rejoicing. Who, I ask you, would have an interest in having Americans adopt a negative attitude toward Palestine? Who in the world would benefit from having Americans take a negative attitude toward Palestinians? Israel is running the biggest concentration camp in the world in Gaza. It's astonishing. They won't allow freedom flotillas. I mentioned Ken O'Keefe, the hero of the Freedom Flotilla. They were trying to bring medical supplies and building construction materials to to the people of Gaza, and the Israelis wouldn't allow them to do it. We had another attempt out of Turkey, and they wouldn't even, the ships couldn't even get out of port. Now, you want to talk about conspiracies. All a conspiracy requires is 2 or more individuals engaging in illegal activity. When those Palestinian commandos came down on those ships in international water, that was an international crime. So, of course, they've been pursued for it. Of course, they've been prosecuted. Of course, they've been held accountable. Think about it. What's going on here? Is the tail wagging the dog? Think about it. So, 3 of these guys, okay, they were held, they were incarcerated for 71 days. They've come to be known as the dancing Israelis. They found explosive residue in the car. They found multiple passports. They found residue of explosives in the car. Does that sound at all suspicious? They were held incarcerated for 71 days until an assistant to then Attorney General John Ashcroft directed their release. They went back to Israel. 3 of them went on Israeli TV, shown here. They explained, we were there to document the destruction of the World Trade Center. Well, that's very interesting, to be in the right place at the right time to document an event that no one knew was coming requires some special kind of precognition, okay? They had it. Urban Moving System was a Mossad asset. These guys were Mossad agents. They were there documenting the event, which would bring great benefit to Israel. No one stood to gain more from 9/11 than Israel. In fact, Benjamin Netanyahu, when he was asked what was his reaction to this, he says, oh, it's very good. And then he qualified and said, well, of course, it's very bad, but now the Americans will know how it feels to be subjected to terrorism, right? Ariel Sharon, just within 2 weeks after 9/11, said, we own America and the Americans know it. Think about that. Did you know Israel owns the United States? Did you know that? The fact is that our foreign policy is dominated by Israeli influence. It's a stunning situation. When I say is the tail wagging the dog, if you actually look, stop, study what's going on. Scholars, prominent scholars, like from Harvard and Chicago, have studied the role of the Israeli lobby in influencing American foreign policy. And when they explain the disproportionate role that is exerted on American foreign policy, they are the ones who are criticized. The message isn't received, the messenger instead is attacked. So here's what it looked like afterwards. It was destroyed below ground level. And in the background there, this is Building 7, okay? And this is kind of weird. Judy has noticed this. There's some kind of fuming going on here. And she thinks it's got something to do with prepping the building for destruction. Now, very interestingly, there was a fellow from the New York Emergency Management entity by the name of Barry Jennings who actually went into Building 7 because there were 2 floors that were the Rudy Giuliani Command and Control Center. They had its own separate water and air supply. One would have supposed Rudy would have gone there, but he didn't. Not only did he not go there, but he said somebody told him that the Twin Towers were going to collapse, which would have astonished any structural engineer in the world, since nothing like that had ever happened before or since, nor, I dare say, on 9/11. But when Barry Jennings went in there, some fireman came along and saw him. He was looking at still steaming coffee, half-eaten sandwiches. He said, we got to get you out of here. He said there were explosions going on all over inside the building as they got out. That one staircase actually collapsed under him. That he felt himself stepping over dead bodies. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. They got him out of the building. He gave interviews. You can go onto YouTube. Look for an interview by Barry Jennings. He was in WTC 7 in the morning, and they were blowing it up from the inside. They were prepping it for the demolition that wouldn't occur until 5:20. And here is the building itself. It had very modest fires. Now, the interesting thing about this building is it may be the most robust building ever designed in the history of civil engineering. It was put up over 2 enormous electrical generators to provide electricity for lower Manhattan. Although even in the Twin Towers, they used steel beams for the core columns that were hollow at the center. In this building, they used solid steel beams. Even though the hollowed out give nearly as much support, they wanted this building to never collapse. The fires were very modest. The claim has been made that it was because of a couple of diesel fuel tanks. Well, diesel fuel tanks were in the building, but diesel burns at a very low temperature, and diesel is non-explosive. And what we had here was actually a classic controlled demolition. This was a fire in San Francisco that burned for 26 hours and didn't collapse. 26 hours and didn't collapse. Okay. Now here's Building 7 going down. I mean, this footage is all over the internet, right? Just go for WTC 7. A Dutch demolition expert viewed this video not knowing where it was from and said, of course, you know, it's classic controlled demolition. This was prepared, experts did this. There are very few who could do this in the world. And when he was told it was from 9/11, he was just floored. 9/11, really? Are you sure? Really? This is very strange. This was a classic controlled demolition. You had the explosion go from the side up the top, up the side over to the top. There's this classic kink. You see it right here? Classic kink where they've taken out one of the main support columns. So if the building starts to fall one way or another, it'll tend to fall inward. And this came down in its own footprint. And looky there, we got 12% debris from Building 7, just as we would expect. But what we did not find with Building 1 and 2, with the North and the South Tower. This is Larry Silverstein, very interesting fellow. He's known as Lucky Larry. Here's an illustration. He took possession of the World Trade Center 6 weeks before 9/11. He immediately insured the building against terrorist attacks for billions of dollars. And for an investment of $114 million after the terrorist attack alleged, because there were 2 planes, he claimed double indemnity, and he wound up with $4.4 billion or more, okay? 114 million yields 4.4 billion. And you can tell me where I can get a deal like that. First time into private hands, very strange. He's changed the security firm that had been conducting security for the World Trade Center from its inception. 6 weeks in advance. He, every day, would go to Windows of the World, a restaurant at the top of the North, I guess, tower. Every day. But on 9/11, no, he didn't show up for breakfast. Isn't that interesting? It's almost as though he knew something was going to happen. Now here's Jane Stanley. This is a reporter for the BBC. At 4:57, she was reporting that the Solomon Brothers building had collapsed. And look at this. What do you think that is over her left shoulder right there? 4:57. Busted. There's Building 7. The Solomon Brothers, see, was another name for Building 7 because Solomon Brothers had bought up, 20 floors or whatever. In fact, they didn't like the arrangement, so they rebuilt the building inside this building. It was so robust, they completely rebuilt it. I mean, that's just a sign of how sturdy was this structure. It should never have collapsed. So here's Jane Stanley reporting the destruction of the World Trade Building 7 23 minutes before it occurred. So I say, if you want an illustration of collusion between the intelligence agencies and the mass media and the government, I mean, here, the BBC, you can't do better than Jane Stanley on Building 7. Too early. Well, with scientific method, we approach this, try to figure out what happened. There are 4 stages: puzzlement, speculation, adaptation, explanation. Puzzlement, something doesn't fit, I don't get it. They claim it was the planes and the fires, but the fires didn't burn long enough or hot enough. They said it was a collapse, but there was no pile of debris. Something's wrong. Speculation, what's the full range of alternatives? Could it have been a natural cause, human causes, conventional, human causes, unconventional? Could it have been arson or dynamite or RDX or thermite or thermate? Earthquakes or hurricanes? How about unconventional, mini nukes, atomic, hydrogen, 3rd generation, 4th, directed energy, HARP, lasers, masers, other alternatives? You got to adapt the hypotheses to the evidence to calculate their likelihoods. Now, assume an hypothesis is true and ask what's the probability of the effects if it is true. One illustration would be, you find, because detectives use the same principle. You find a body and it's got abrasions around the neck, but it has no knife wounds or bullet holes. So what's the probability this person died from being shot? Well, there's no bullet hole. I think it's fair to say the probability this person was shot is 0. How about being stabbed with a knife? Again, no knife wounds. Probability they died from being stabbed by a knife, 0. How about strangulation? Well, there are abrasions around the neck, obviously greater than 0. So if you compare the likelihoods, the hypothesis with the highest likelihood is the preferable hypothesis. But you're not entitled to accept the hypothesis with the highest likelihood until the evidence is settled down. So you send the body off to the morgue, they do a medical examination and discover, although there are abrasions on the neck, the person died from poisoning. Okay? Well, that's just typical in scientific inquiries. If you watch Law and Order, you see these kinds of things all the time, right? That's one of my wife's favorite shows. We could watch 10 Law and Orders in the same day, I suppose. But now, explanation then. When sufficient evidence is available, then the best supported hypothesis is preferable, but it's in the tentative and fallible fashion of science, meaning if you get new evidence, new hypotheses, you may have to revise your view. Well, looky here. Could this be a natural, this could be a hurricane or a tornado or something like that? Well, it was only the buildings that had WTC designations that were destroyed. Well, that's interesting. That's certainly not a natural phenomenon. Here from an aerial view, this is building 6, which had this huge gaping hole in the center. It was gouged out. Here's building 5 that had all these little circular holes. Those are very peculiar. They're actually all over the place. One of Judy Wood's students counted as many as 50 of these little circular holes. I'll show you other anomalies here with respect to the different buildings. Okay, it's building 6. Now there's WTC 7, right? That's all the debris. Well, here's 1. What's the difference between 7? 7 was 47 stories. You got about, 5.5 floors of debris. Here you had the South Tower was 110, and there's no debris. Something very strange. Now here's this building 6, and it's been gouged out. This is inside that gouge. A long time ago, I lost a kidney, okay? And the surgeon removed it. And when he removed it, there was this open space. I mean, my other organs would settle in, but it's as though there were the surgical operation on this building, and it was just removed from the center. Here's building 5 with these circular cutouts. They're all over the place. They're very strange. What would have caused those? Here's building 4. Now, this building 4 had an extension. I'm defining with a cursor here, okay? It had an extension that's completely gone. It's completely gone. So you got half of building 4 and the rest is completely gone. Here's building 3. This was the Marriott Hotel. It's as though some enormous Paul Bunyan took a gigantic axe and gave it a whack. Look at that. What in the world would cause that? And there are these so-called toasted cars. There are cars all over the place. They look very strange. They have certain kinds of, burning and damage, but you have some of them where the back of it is perfectly pristine and the front of it is completely destroyed. Here are a couple others. They look like wet rags, right? So what in the world has caused this kind of damage? Here's yet another. Here's a steel beam that's bent like a pretzel. What in the world caused that? That's some of the evidence that needs to be explained. Now, here's something you have to understand about the destruction of the Twin Towers. They were built inside what is known as the bathtub. See the word bathtub? It was like a dike to protect the basements from being flooded by Hudson River water, okay? If the bathtub had been shattered, the Hudson River would have flooded beneath lower Manhattan. This is the most valuable real estate in the world. It would have gone into the subway tunnels and the PATH train tunnels, which connect New York City to New Jersey, okay? I mean, the damage would have been unbelievable. I mean, catastrophic. So I said, weren't those terrorists thoughtful? They found a way to destroy the Twin Towers without damaging the bathtub. I say, that's pretty clever of those guys. These must be the world's most thoughtful terrorists. And here's the excavation, okay? Here's the excavation where WTC-1 and WTC-2 stood, okay? Now, here's inside the North Tower, excavation of the bathtub. Who would have an interest in destroying the Twin Towers but not damaging the bathtub? Think about it. Now, Twin Towers at this point in time had a problem with occupancy. They also had a problem with asbestos. They were built in the late 1960s, right? They were laden with asbestos. The Port Authority had directed, actually they'd only gone into the private hands, right, 6 weeks before, but there was supposed to be an asbestos excavation. Can you imagine constructing scaffolding around a 110-story building in order to remove asbestos? I think the estimates would have run around $1 billion to do it. Now, Rudy Giuliani was on the spot. I'll tell you, this is really amazing. He had hundreds of dump trucks lined up to start hauling away all that debris right away. But what people don't notice is these dump trucks, which were hauling away all the steel from this site before there'd been any opportunity to examine it, were bringing something in. They were bringing in dirt. This is quite fascinating because over time, and Judy Wood has documented this at her website at drjudywood.com, and now she has a book that documents all this. It's called Where Did the Towers Go?, which is a simply excellent question. The debris pile is actually increasing over time. I mean, look at all this dirt. That dirt wasn't there originally. That dirt was brought in. Now, something similar happened at Chernobyl when the Russians had their nuclear disaster, right? They brought in tons of dirt to try to absorb the radioactivity. And the question that arises here, well, could there have been a comparable problem to deal with and therefore required bringing in tons and tons of dirt? Here is W's brother, Marvin, who was actually on the board of directors of a security firm associated with the Twin Towers security. There was also an Israeli firm named Kroll that was involved here. And there was yet another Israeli firm that was responsible for security at the airports where the planes allegedly took off. Well, other things were going on. Okay, now at the Pentagon, here's the original hit point, allegedly. It's about 10 feet high, 16 or 17 feet wide. There were two cars in front. There was this chain link fence. There were two enormous spools of coil you can't see here. But there were unbroken windows all around it. I mean, you can't see them all, but there are unbroken windows here. What you do not see, however, is a massive pile of aluminum debris from a 100-ton airliner. You don't see the wings, you don't see the tail, you don't see bodies, seats, or luggage. Here's where the plane allegedly flew in. Now, this is peculiar because we already have smoke. There seems to have been a secondary explosion. I mean, assuming the photograph is genuine, because we are trading here also with many kinds of fakery. And there are lampposts that were allegedly hit. According to the government, this plane flew at over 500 miles an hour, very close to the ground, hit several lampposts before impacting with a building at the location I show, even though there's no indication of any plane crashing there. Let me just mention a couple problems with this scenario. Aeronautical engineers have explained to me that a plane flying at full speed close to the ground can't get closer to the ground than approximately one wing length because of the occurrence of what's called ground effect, which is the accumulation of a pocket of compressed gas beneath the wings and the fuselage. So this plane had a 125-foot wingspan total, which means from one aeronautical engineer who was also a pilot, it couldn't have got closer than 60 feet to the ground. According to the government, it was skimming the ground. It was actually skimming the ground. There should have been a lot of damage to the lawn, and as I'm going to show you, there's no damage to the lawn. And if a plane had hit one of these lampposts, then it's those old Newton laws again. If the plane had hit the lamppost at 500 miles an hour, the effects would have, the stationary lamppost, the effect would have been the same if the plane were stationary and a lamppost traveling 500 miles an hour hit the plane's wing. Now, what do you think would happen if a plane were stationary and were hit by a lamppost going 500 miles an hour? It would rip the wing off the plane. It would throw it off its trajectory. It would whip around. The tail would break off. The jet fuel stored in the wing would burst into fire. It would be quite spectacular, but it would also be utterly consistent with the fantasy scenario we've been given by the government here. Now, after, and Jamie McIntyre was explaining this, it was about 45 minutes later that these upper floors collapsed. So here you have, now this is very interesting because look at the facade there. The facade of the Pentagon is limestone. Limestone is a very soft, porous stone. Remember what happened when those 767s hit the North and the South Tower? We have those cookie cutter cutouts. Well, how can it be that the steel and concrete buildings have these cookie cutter cutouts, and at the Pentagon, which has this soft, porous limestone, there's no indication of any plane at all? Something's going on. Just remember what Jamie McIntyre said. From my close-up inspection, there's no indication of any plane having hit anywhere near the Pentagon. Now, evidently under extreme pressure, he was later asked to revise that statement, and he actually did make a public remark that anyone would be dumb if they denied that a plane had hit the Pentagon. But you got to contrast what he said on the scene at the time that you saw where he says, from his close-up inspection, there's no indication of any plane having hit anywhere near the Pentagon. Now, this is the kind of thing that's supposed to have happened according to the government. See how those engines are practically on the ground? Here's a plane. Here's a 757, okay? It's got those enormous engines hanging down. Now, here's the lawn. These are the civilian lime green fire trucks that were in the vicinity, and they came up and they extinguished the very modest fires of the Pentagon. And look at the lawn. The lawn is more important. The lawn is perfectly clear, green, and free of debris. There's no debris here. Now later, debris would start showing up. So I've asked myself, well, where could that debris have come from? You couldn't have the officers in mid rushing out to plant the debris. There was a C-130 that was circling the building. The best guess I've been able to come up with is that they were dumping the debris out of the C-130 because it becomes, you know, kind of floating down to the ground. Well, if you don't think much about it, you think, well, it's sort of a delayed response. The fact that fire trucks were already there, had already extinguished the fire, so the crash had long since occurred and the lawn was perfectly clear, doesn't, you know, compute. You sort of miss the point. Well, get this. Look at this fascinating piece of debris, okay? It's from a 757. Now, it shows no signs of fire. The Pentagon initially released 5 frames. There were more than 80 videos, security cameras, that could have shown what happened. The Pentagon didn't release any of those. It released 5 frames. 4 of them are this enormous fireball when the plane is hitting the building. And that's fascinating all by itself, because remember when the planes hit the building in New York, there wasn't any fireball. The plane was already inside the building before it blew up. Remember the north out? And yet now at the Pentagon, you have this fantastic fireball just as the plane is hitting the building. Well, that's pretty odd. I mean, is the behavior of planes hitting buildings so different in New York and the Pentagon? And looky here, this piece of fuselage. This is fascinating. A lawyer who is also a newspaper reporter who lives in Columbus, Ohio, thought there was something funny about this piece of fuselage, and you can't quite see it here, but there are other photographs right here where I'm showing. It's got a piece of vine, okay? There's a piece of vine attached to this fuselage. And he traced it back to the crash of a 757 in Cali, Colombia in a rainforest, where it was kind of a slow crash, and this piece of fuselage was ripped out from this piece of vine, which was characteristic of the region, was captured by it. So the question becomes, well, what's it doing on the Pentagon lawn in 2001? They keep this stuff around, see? I mean, they need a prop. I mean, that's what they did. Here are a couple of guys out there, and what are they doing? Well, that's a good question. You know, is this a pickup or a delivery? And here's this blue tarp. Now, I've had different explanation of what's going on here, that they were actually bringing in a bunch of blue tarps. So my belief is they were taking something out, you know, removing something from the area that might have given the game away. Now, here's the way that plane is supposed to have entered the building if the official account were true. April Gallup, a civilian employee, was inside the building. She actually had brought her infant to work with her that day. And after this explosion took place, she walked out of the opening and found no components of any plane. It was like Jamie McIntyre. There's no evidence any plane had crashed there, none at all. Now, there have been a couple analyses of the damage done to the support columns here. And according to a study by A.K. Dudney, who's the same guy at Western Ontario who did the study with the cell phones, and Ralph Longspaw, who's an engineer, they found the damage to the support columns inconsistent with a large plane, but consistent with a small plane. Here's another study from Purdue, and what's peculiar about this, they're claiming the reason there was no debris is that the plane was shredded. Okay, the plane was shredded by those support columns. But one of the curious features here is there's a feature missing. There are no engines on this plane. Those engines are virtually indestructible. Would you believe that the engines were not recovered from the Pentagon? I mean, what could be more telling that this is all a fraud than that the engines were not even recovered? So here are some of those frames, right? I'm talking about these fireballs, right? That's 3 of the 4. But looking up here, and this one, notice it's conveniently labeled plane. Now, the date and time are wrong. But it's conveniently labeled plane. And this appears to have been kind of like a little experiment. Let's see if the public will buy this, right? They would eventually release 3 of their more than 80 videos, but none of them had any more of the impact site than these frames, plus the one more of the fireball. So here's what it might have looked like hypothetically, maybe at a greater angle, right? It's supposed to be pretty spectacular, right? As I say, this really doesn't look like what we saw in New York, does it? So you might say, well, if one of these is authentic, then since they're completely inconsistent in their depiction of the plane hitting the building, the other must not be. But of course, don't overlook the possibility that they're both fraudulent, and that mistakes were simply made in the way they sought to perpetrate the fraud. So this piece of a compressor was found at the Pentagon. It's too small to be from a 757. It's too large to be from a cruise missile. But there is a possibility that it could have come from a plane that was made up to look like a Boeing 757. And one candidate is the A3 Sky Warrior, which was known as the Walrus. It was the largest plane ever designed to take off from a carrier. Here's a silhouette of the A3. What's interesting is, you've got this thing right here above the gate mechanism that does look like a plane. There's a white plume trailing here. Now, aeronautical engineers and pilots have told me that white plume cannot be from an jet exhaust. It would be black, but it could be from a missile being fired by this plane into the building. So I have for some time taken seriously that possibility when it's combined with the Longspaw and Dewdney study of the support columns that was consistent with a small plane but not a large one. So if you impose a silhouette of the A3 over this, it looks like it might be inconsistent. Here is a study that I asked to be done by Jack White, who's a legendary photo analyst. He's much better at this than I am, to size the image of a Boeing 757 to this image of a plane using the tail. And it turns out that the Boeing 757 is 155 feet long, and that this plane is only about half that size, and it happens the A3 Sky Warrior is 76 feet long. The Pentagon itself is about 77 feet high. But if something is wrong here, I mean, this plane, if this is actually a bona fide 757, it should be twice as large, so clearly it isn't, which indicates this frame too may be completely fabricated. Again, coming back to the lawn, where's the debris? Where's the damage from those low-hanging engines? It should have created massive havoc to the lawn, but there's no indication there. Donald Rumsfeld announced the day before 9/11 that the Pentagon had lost track of $2.3 trillion. $2.3 trillion. Now, Donald Rumsfeld is a very experienced Washington politician. So he would know a big story like that, if you announce it on a Monday, and 9/11 was Tuesday, that it's likely to be that reporters are going to follow the story, they're going to document, it's going to grow legs, as they say. So what's he doing announcing $2.3 trillion missing from the Pentagon budget the day before 9/11? It's as though he knew something was going to intervene, it would be obliterated from consciousness, and the next day be able to waltz into the halls of Congress and ask for hundreds of billions more in defense spending, which is exactly what happened. So, there was a rumor that the Capitol was next. And the members of Congress and the Senate, they all poured out on the steps of the Capitol, and they looked across the Potomac, and what did they see? They saw billowing black smoke. And I asked myself, billowing black smoke? Where did that come from? I mean, remember the civilian fire trucks had extinguished the very modest fires that had occurred at the Pentagon. And it turned out the billowing black smoke was coming from a series of enormous dumpsters. When I was still here in Duluth, before I retired and moved to Madison in June of 2006, another student of the Pentagon came by, and he showed me 44 more frames from a different angle. You could actually see light between the dumpsters in the building. So I say, what's going on here? I mean, if there was a genuine crash of a plane, why are they faking smoke using dumpsters, which is a classic ploy of Hollywood? I mean, this is a special effect. And look at this. We saw all those gigantic fireballs, right? But looky here. This is when they're excavating the part where the floor collapsed. Here, on this floor, there's a wooden stand. It appears to hold an Oxford Unabridged Dictionary. It's not even singed. In fact, you don't see any indications here of fire, which has led me to infer that those fireball photographs themselves appear to be frauds. They appear to be fake. And of course, it's entirely possible, therefore, that that image of the plane above the gate mechanism might also be fake. It's certainly not a Boeing 757. Why would a missile be used when you have the white plume? Well, remember that missing 2.3 trillion? The section of the Pentagon that was hit, the West Wing, had just been reinforced. It was like it was made interesting choice of the terrorists. It was like it was reinforced, okay, so it could take a tremendous impact and not damage any other part of the Pentagon. And that just happened to be the location that these very thoughtful terrorists chose to hit. It was largely bereft of files and personnel, except for some from the Office of Naval Intelligence, who may have been trying to figure out what was going on 9/11, and others who I surveyed the 125 casualties from the Pentagon. This is exclusive of any aircraft casualties, so alleged. The 125 casualties from the Pentagon, I found 2 to 3 dozen that were budget analysts, budget experts, accountants, and all that. And I believe what happened is that Rumsfeld directed they all get into the West Wing, bring all the documents and records for that missing 2.3 trillion, and find it, because here he was embarrassed. He'd had to go publicly announce this missing 2.3 trillion. So he got all the documents and records there, and then they took them out. And pilots have done a wonderful job. They've also studied Flight 93, which is a very curious event indeed. But in addition to the pilots' work, there's another group called Citizens Investigation Team who have put out a documentary called National Security Alert. They went down, they noticed in relation to the two theories about the plane at the Pentagon that in between there was a structure, a Citgo gas station. And that if the official story were true, then the plane had to come in south of the Citgo, and if the alternative, the approach were true, north. And they found a dozen witnesses who all reported came in north of the Citgo station. And they even interviewed a fellow named, Paul England, who was a taxi driver who allegedly had one of these lampposts embedded in his taxi. And he's a black guy, and he was very nervous talking about it, and it appeared he'd been intimidated and coerced to participate. And if you read between the lines, he was saying he knew this was all fakery and a fraud, but he had to go along with it. I mean, it was very stunning to see this guy who's often been used as evidence, as though it was supposed to be convincing that a plane actually hit the Pentagon. So what we got going here? Here's another aspect of it. This is Flight 77. It's actually allegedly on the radar. How many Americans know there was a complete stand down of the U.S. Air Force on the morning of 9/11, okay? Webster Tarpley, in his book 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in the USA, in the second edition, in his introduction, shows there were as many as 17 different anti-terrorist drills going on that morning. It was like a patchwork quilt. I think any way that could be found where the Air Force might respond, they had some drill that sent them out over the Atlantic or kept them grounded or whatever. In June, they had changed the standard operating procedure so that area commanders didn't have control to authorize the takedown of a hijack. It had to go through the Department of Defense and be authorized by the Secretary of Defense. And would you believe Donald Rumsfeld was missing for 2 hours? No one could figure out where Rumsfeld was for 2 hours on the morning of 9/11. When you might have been trying to get authorization to shoot down a plane or to have a military response. I mean, that's really astounding. I mean, how do you think those terrorists were able to arrange that? So you have this plane, okay, and it's on the radar. So all these air traffic controllers were seeing all these blips on the radar, and they didn't know if they were real or Memorex, okay? Because there were all these phony blips on the radar. It was massively confusing. So here, according to the official account, this plane flies out to the Kentucky-Ohio border, but it's not on the radar coming back. And the claim has been made that's because the terrorists turned off the transponder. Well, the transponder gives out a positive signal that's an ID. But it doesn't take the plane out of the sky, which means it should have still been on the radar screen. You should have radar tracking if you didn't have a transponder. So there's something very strange about it not being here. And if there's anything to the idea of that smaller plane approaching the building and firing a missile, then it appears to have been substituted in the Washington area. We do have a fascinating story of Norman Mineta, who was our Secretary of Transportation, who was in an underground bunker with Dick Cheney, when an aide came up to Cheney and said, "Sir, it's 50 miles out. Sir, it's 40 miles out. Sir, it's 30 miles out. Sir, do the orders still stand?" And Cheney whipped around, nearly bit off his head, and said, "Of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?" Well, think about it. The order had to be to not shoot down the plane. If you shoot down the plane, you use the passengers of the plane, but you don't lose the personnel and the property of the target. If this was a plane approaching the Pentagon, the obvious thing was to shoot it down. The aide was concerned because it wasn't shot down. When the 9/11 Commission report, McKnight testified under oath to the 9/11 Commission, but his testimony was not included in his report, nor was there made any mention of Building 7. Those are rather stunning omissions. And in fact, in a book called Without Precedent, Lee Hamilton and Tom Keene, who were the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, explained that they were very unsatisfied with the Pentagon that gave them 3 different versions of what happened on 9/11. And indeed, Condoleezza Rice and others would claim they had no idea that aircraft could be used as weapons, and yet there was a simulation at the Pentagon within a year of the events of 9/11. Here's a mock-up of it, and the plane that they happened to be using for the mock-up was, guess what, a Boeing 757. And I say, if you're going to fake it, you might as well mock it up so you know what's going on. Now, look at these different fireballs alleged to be from the 3 locations, because we're going out to Pennsylvania. This one in the lower right, allegedly taken by Val McClutchy, it appears to be phony. It looks like it's Photoshopped, because you actually compare this fireball, and it looks much more like demolitions, for example, from Iraq than it does from a plane crash. You compare it to a plane crash, and it has very different effects, here's a reporter out there in Shanksville who was telling him, I actually, played this multiple times, that there was no signs. I mean, two reporters there independently reported that the eerie aspect of this plane crash site was there were no indication that any plane had crashed there. Stop and think about it. The coroner came up there and he said the odd thing to him was he hadn't even found a speck of blood. Not only no bodies, but he hadn't even found a speck of blood. So here you have this, you have this cavity, you have this gouge. Colonel George Nelson said it looked to him like someone had come out there with a bulldozer, dug a trench, filled it with trash, and blown it up. Okay? Now the explanation that was given, and there were these people who were walking around, okay, but there aren't any parts of any plane. Walking around, there aren't any parts of any plane. This is what it should have looked like, right? According to the official account, the let's roll, the passengers on this plane try to retake the plane, so the terrorists decided to crash the plane deliberately, crashed it into the ground, and it disappeared. Why did it disappear? Well, this was supposed to be soft ground. One version has it that the plane crashed into an abandoned mine shaft. And I say, well, we know what to do with miners trapped in an abandoned mine shaft. Get out the bright lights, they have equipment, we dig 24/7, and hope by some miracle someone might have survived. They did not do that here. They tidied up the scene, they kept the reporters, photographers 1,000 yards away, and when it was done, they trimmed the burned trees and bushes around so it couldn't be analyzed to determine chemically that it wasn't caused by jet fuel. And in fact, the EPA subsequently did a study and found there was no jet fuel contamination of the ground at this site where an immense amount of jet fuel allegedly had been delivered. So there's studies now of these flights where one theory is that the plane was actually shot down by this guy, Major Rick Gibney, and then he was given a congressional medal and all this stuff. And, it's fascinating, but of course it contradicts the official story, but it's possible that a plane might have been shot down there. We just don't seem to have evidence that a plane was shot down. And the other story is that the plane, Flight 93, allegedly landed at Cleveland. This is quite a bizarre story. According to I think it was an ABC television team was out there, the mayor of the city, whose name was White, came out there to say that Flight 93 had landed there, had been taken to a distant part of the airport in great secrecy. They'd unloaded some 200 passengers with great security. Well, to get 200 passengers, each of these flights, they were transcontinental, but they only were about 1/4 full. I mean, it's very bizarre. Others have observed that I don't see how any commercial carrier can stay in business if they're flying across country with only 1/4 of their seats filled. So to get to 200 passengers, you'd have to combine the passengers from all 4 of the alleged flights. Okay? So some 200 were allegedly, by this story, taken to a distant hangar and unloaded. And the story I followed was revised 14 different times before they abandoned it. So something very odd is going on there. The whole thing with the passengers is bizarre. because it looks as though the names are phony. Half the names are phony, others are military industrial related individuals. The whole thing's very strange. It's like the witnesses at the Pentagon. I did 3 2-hour interviews with a guy named Mike Sparks, who's got an extensive military background. We went through about 90 alleged Pentagon witnesses. And of all the 90, there weren't more than 3 who were even in the right position to have said, have seen what they claim to have said. But of course, the other evidence I've shown gives overwhelming evidence that no plane actually crashed at the Pentagon. At least no Boeing 757 crashed at the Pentagon. So something's going on here. It's an elaborate charade. Here's the distinction between those smoke clouds, by the way. Here's the Val McClatchy original. Here's a detonation, and here's from an actual plane crash. Okay, they're very different. A member of the House of Representatives asked for the government to explain why the names of 3,000 victims from 9/11 are not included in the Social Security Death Index. 3,000 names of victims, alleged victims from 9/11, are not included in the Social Security Death Index. Now, I had a member of scholars do a study of the 19 alleged phone callers from the flights. I already mentioned that David Ray Griffin has shown all those were fake. But he had done a study independently, and he found in relation to Social Security Index, Death Index of the 19, only 1 name was on the Social Security Index, and from the Survivors Benefit Fund, none of their relatives had received money from the Social Security Benefit Fund. Dick Cheney and George Bush, and Dick Cheney, in my opinion, was the executor of 9/11. This involved a coalition between the neocons, who believed there was a unique historical opportunity to create an American empire worldwide for the next 100 years that was predicated on the demise of the Soviet Union. They were worried that the American people wouldn't support seizing this unique opportunity because they wouldn't be inclined to support wars of aggression such as we have launched in Iraq and Afghanistan, unless there were some traumatic catalyzing event which they described as a new Pearl Harbor. If you listen carefully to the anchor talking about the events in New York, she said, some are describing this as a new Pearl Harbor. They were not only claiming that this Democratic Front for Palestine had claimed responsibility, which was simply absurd, but they're saying that some would also describe it as new Pearl. How can you know it's a new Pearl Harbor? This thing just happened. Nobody knows what happened. Everyone's scratching their head. Where did these 2 buildings go? Where did the towers go? It's completely absurd. And would you believe that in 2007, Ed Hoss, who runs the Muckraker Report, which is an online journal, noticed that a wanted poster for Osama bin Laden listed a lot of offenses, but nothing about 9/11. So he called the FBI and spoke to their representative, Rex Toomb, T-O-M-B by name. And Rex Toomb told Ed Hoss that the reason there was nothing about 9/11 on the Osama bin Laden wanted poster was because the FBI, this is our FBI, had no hard evidence that Osama bin Laden had anything to do with 9/11. In the one authentic interview we have with bin Laden, and there have been many faked and phonied since then, he said he had nothing to do with 9/11, that it was a government within the government in the United States, that they wanted to create a justification for attacking Islam and Muslims. And he also observed that it is contrary to the principles of Islam to kill innocent women and children. I mean, it was just not the kind of crime that they would commit. So you start putting this together. If you realize how many neocons were in the administration, you had Dick Cheney, you had Donald Rumsfeld, you had Donald Fife, you had Richard Pearl, you had Paul Wolfowitz, you had aided and abetted by people like Charles Krauthammer and William Kristol, who very much were very big on removing Saddam Hussein. We even had the Secretary of the Treasury was astonished that at the first cabinet meeting of the Bush administration, they were talking about removing Saddam Hussein and invading Iraq. And this was long before 9/11 would take place. It goes on down to General Richard Myers, who appears to have been very deeply involved in this, Rudy Giuliani, and Larry Silverstein with assistance from their friends in the Mossad. The principal rationale appears to have been take control of Iraqi oil. It was extremely high quality. You can take it out of the ground cheap and sell it dear. You could even leave it in the ground, and you could then elevate the price of the rest of the available supply because there's less available. It was supposed to have a pipeline through Israel. I expect Israel was going to tap into it and solve its energy needs off the cuff. Israel wanted Saddam Hussein taken out and Iraq destroyed because it was a modern, sophisticated Arab state that was exerting political rivalry in the region. It had a national health care system, which we do not yet have. It had a wonderful system of public education. It had reliable infrastructure providing water and electricity, which we have bombed into the Stone Age. It had antiquities and artifacts dating back thousands of years. And the neocons wanted to create a situation where they could get American forces into the geopolitically sensitive Middle East and project it outward as a part of their master plan for creating a new American century, worldwide domination for the next 100 years. And with the contributions from our friends in Israel, our gallant allies, we have now become, along with Israel, the most reviled and despised countries in the world, and I'm sorry to say, the greatest aggressor nations. It was Frank Wisner of the CIA who invented the idea of the great organ he could use of the New York Times, the LA Times, propagate any message that the CIA wanted to distribute. Carl Bernstein did a study back in 1977 published in the Rolling Stone in which he explained, based on his interviews with members of the CIA, that they boasted their greatest achievements, the greatest successes were with Time Life, the New York Times, and CBS. And I can assure you, if you had a lock on Time Life, New York Times, and CBS in those days, you had a lock on the American media. And William Colby, before his very surprising, unexpected death in a peculiar kayaking accident, had observed that the CIA owns everyone of significance in the major media. So if you want to know why questions like those I've been raising here today aren't being covered by the national press, well, there's some pretty good reasons why that's the case. I'm sorry to tell you that 9/11 was an elaborate illusion. It was undertaken for political purposes. It included all kinds of props and deception. And it most certainly does not provide any justification for wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which appear to benefit the profit margins of a select number of American corporations, especially the oil companies, which are actually transnational. They no longer have any loyalty to the United States. Also to benefit Israel, driven by an ideology that was going to create a new American empire for the next 100 years. It hasn't quite worked out, but that was the plan. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased you came, and I'd be glad to take any questions anyone has. We actually have a mic set up on both sides if anyone would like to come to take advantage of the mics. I would mention, Mel's back here with the camera. I'll just say there's some DVDs out there. There's some, even this is from the conference I had in Madison. If anyone wants to support additional research on 9/11, that's one way we seek to raise money to do it. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have. Yes?
When I first learned about the project for the New American Century, my friend looked at the white paper and the fact that the signatories for the founding document of the PNAC constituted or comprised most of the Bush administration.
That's right.
From Elliott Abrams, Paul Wolfowitz, blah, 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 blah.
That's right.
And that you can, that they had the temerity to maintain this website, which they blacked out a couple of years ago for a few months, and then put back up because they realized they couldn't cover their tracks. But it's significant, and I wanted to know, follow up on what you were saying, that in January of 1998, they sent a letter to President Clinton saying our top national foreign policy priority should be to get rid of Saddam Hussein, to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, in the interest of American hegemony, and that they said the same thing to George W. Bush after his election. And then the most interesting remark that they made was on September 20th, 2001, they wrote a letter, they published a letter to George W. Bush saying, in part, even, quote, even if there is no evidence linking Saddam Hussein to the events of 9/11, this should still be our first national priority. So what they were saying was, they've been finding this act for years, and this was a conspicuous pretext and a remarkable thing to me, and I'd like your reaction to this. Maybe you've already given it. With
I think you're right up and down the line. And this was Eisenhower's apparently so upset with the rise of Castro in Cuba, where he nationalized the property of Anaconda Copper and United Fruit, which of course gets the corporations to immediately label him a communist because he's interfering with their profit margin. It's like Cesar Chavez in Venezuela, right? He nationalizes the oil companies there, and they immediately classify him as a communist. But Castro, like Chavez, even like Ho Chi Minh, really just wanted to use the resources of their country to benefit their own countrymen. I mean, it's not that they were so much communists, it's that they were, not willing to go along with the exploitation of the natural resources of their country. So Eisenhower said to Lyman Lemnitzer, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, he said, if you don't have a real reason to attack Cuba, make one up. And this led to what's come to be known as Operation Northwoods, where the Joint Chiefs began proposing fantastic schemes to JFK, which he was having vetted by Maxwell Taylor, and they were rejecting them right and left. One of the schemes was, if the Atlas rocket carrying popular astronaut John Glenn into space were to be blown apart, they would have irrefutable proof that Fidel Castro had done it. And ask yourself, how could they have irrefutable proof that Fidel Castro had done it if they weren't doing it themselves and planning it? They talked about assassinations and bombings in the United States they were going to blame on Castro. One of their great schemes, this is the one that really blew my mind, they were going to load an aircraft full of students going on a vacation, fly it over Cuba, and shoot it down. And they even talked about how the list of casualties would inflame the public, and they'd want the, Kennedy rise up and crush Castro. They said in the fine print, the plane would land at a secret base and they'd offload the students and fill the plane with dummies. But can you imagine one of these dummies showing up in Cuba or one of these students in the United States? So it was bizarre. But it's that kind of thing, precisely you're talking about. Fabricated reason. Doesn't got the weapons of mass destruction. Well, Saddam actually owned some of those weapons of mass destruction. We knew because we sold them to him. You may forget the famous photograph of Donald Rumsfeld shaking Saddam's hand when he was on one of those missions to sell these weapons to Saddam. But Saddam was smart enough that he got rid of them. He knew they could be used as a pretext to attack him. They got rid of them. Saddam actually, all things considered, when you consider, given the complexities of Iraqi society, when you have the factions between the Sunnis and the Shia and the Kurds, it required a heavy hand. It was like Tito in Yugoslavia. You have all these conflicting factions. If you don't have a strong man at the top, you can have chaos in the country. I mean, that's the way Iraq has been unfolding now, the way that Yugoslavia unfolded in the aftermath, right, of the balkanization, a whole bunch of little countries that are insignificant. And it's by coordinating their efforts that they achieve any degree of greatness. It's true Saddam was rather brutal to certain enemies. I've heard some horror stories that are really creepy about Saddam, but for most of the Iraqi people, actually, they had reliable water and electricity, this national health care plan. They had a wonderful system of public education. By the way, my wife has copies of this particular DVD outside if anyone is interested in that, but I want to answer your questions. Please continue.
My question is, do you believe that bin Laden was actually killed? Was that him?
No, this is fantastic. Bin Laden died about 15 December 2001. A very high-ranking government guy, Steve Prisnick, has revealed that, but we all do it. There were local obituaries that reported his death in December 2001. He was buried in an unmarked grave. Even Fox News in February 2002 reported that bin Laden had died. All the videos and other reports of him since then have been obvious fakeries. I was publishing press releases from scholars revealing that they were forms of deception. Person wearing jewelry, it's non-Islamic. Saddam wouldn't wear any jewelry. He had the wrong nose, the wrong face, the wrong complexion. It's all fakery. I mean, the American people have been playing for saps for so long, it's unbelievable, and they get so arrogant. So you have this claim that they have this operation in Pakistan, to take out bin Laden, right? Now he's supposed to be killed and everyone rejoices. Now stop and think about what was going on at the time. Well, Barack Obama was under tremendous pressure because of his birth certificate. And I'll tell you, I have been looking at that birth certificate issue. I found 3 different versions of birth certificate. The only one that appears to be authentic is from Africa. The guy does not appear to have been born in Hawaii. That appears to be an elaborate cover story. So he was under pressure for that. He hadn't closed Guantanamo, right? He decided to keep it open. He couldn't get it closed. The government wouldn't pass money to close it. He's got forces in Pakistan. People are upset by the forces in Pakistan. They're using these Predator drones. I did a study. You can find it online. It's entitled On the Ethical Conduct of Warfare, Predator Drones, where I report statistics that show we're killing 140 innocent civilians for every designated insurgent. 140 for every designated insurgent. And remember, we're the occupying force there. We have launched a war of aggression here. So those insurgents, you know, from our point of view, are actually freedom fighters from the point of view of Afghanistan or Iraq. So what happens here? Well, in a single master stroke, by going in and killing bin Laden, we vindicate Guantanamo because we claim the tip came from Guantanamo, so that justifies our torturing prisoners. We justify having our troops in Pakistan because if they hadn't been there, they couldn't conduct this operation. The whole birth certificate issue is absolutely blown off the front page, as much as Donald Rumsfeld's $2.3 trillion was blown off the front page by the events of 9/11. They show a photograph of Obama with the vice president, with Hillary Clinton, intensely staring at a TV screen, and you presume they're watching The Office. It goes down live. In fact, I found news reports saying this was the Obama administration watching the event as they unfolded, but then Leon Panetta, the director of the CIA, blew that story by pointing out that for 20 or 25 minutes there was no coverage at all. Well, these operations only take like 5 minutes, so if there are 20 or 25 minutes there was no coverage, there wasn't any coverage. And local residents said this photograph that was supposed to be bin Laden with a clicker watching TV, right? I can't think of anything less likely than Osama bin Laden would be sitting with a clicker watching TV. Said, no, that was not bin Laden, that was the owner of the home. It wasn't bin Laden. The whole thing is fake, phony. They played it unbelievably. I was walking around the house just complaining out loud. It must have driven Jan Bannon. I was so pissed off that this fake, completely phony attack was being broadcast. And then get this, then they dump his body in the ocean. They also claim they had DNA identification within 12 hours. A DNA expert explained it was impossible to get DNA processed in that period of time. So that was a phony claim. Dumping the body in the ocean was supposed to be in accordance with Islamic tradition. But in Islam, you have to respect the body. Dumping it in the ocean, you allow it to be chewed up by the sharks and the fish and the crustaceans and the crabs. Completely non-Islamic. So I can discuss this with Kevin Barrett, who's himself a convert to Islam and is the founder of the co-founder of Muslims for 9/11 Truth. This is ridiculous. It's all rubbish. It's rubbish. And they pushed it so aggressively. I was telling everyone in earshot that this was just another way of reaffirming the phony story of 9/11. I tell you, it's all fraud. You know, they say how history is a pack of lies, a living play on the dead. Well, I'll tell you about these big events. That's exactly true. Exactly true. One big liar after another. In fact, I've also observed, the further you go in Washington, it's a function of how big a lie you're willing to tell. And got some big liars in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Jim. I don't think I've ever seen anybody who could talk that long without coming up for air. But I have about 3 questions.
This is Bob Boo, the publisher of The Reader, who has done a wonderful job with a couple articles of mine recently, in case any of you haven't noticed. I want to give this man his due. There are very few editors and publishers who are willing to come anywhere near 9/11. The CIA influence is so oppressive. You're not going to find the stories you'll find in The Reader, in the New York Times, or the Washington Post. I'm telling you. Right here in Duluth.
Thank you. So one question, what caused the early fire at the World Trade Center that burned for 3 hours at 2,000 degrees? I mean, that isn't like newspaper laying around.
What actually caused that fire in 1975? I think it may have had electrical origin, but I'm not certain about that, Bob. That's an interesting question.
Because I mean,
But
what would be the fuel that would keep it going? I mean, we're busy saying that jet fuel doesn't burn that hot.
Bob, you can dig out the stories. They're all there. You know, just do a Google on the fire in the North Tower, 1975. I mean, I dug out the newspaper articles, and you had the fire chief saying it was intense. It was like a blowtorch in there. And he was saying it was 2,000 degrees, and it was 3 hours, so it was a nice test of the underwriter's laboratory certification.
Sure, I'm just curious what would be the fuel.
I don't know.
Because whatever fuel was there, and I'm doing a couple of devil's advocate type of questions.
Yeah, it's okay.
So whatever fuel was in the World Trade Center in 1975, let's say desks or paper or something, was probably also still there in 2001.
Well, no, an ordinary office fire. I mean, this is familiar, right? They only burn at around 500 degrees.
Well, then what was burning in the World Trade Center?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I mean, I like the question. I'll go back and see if I can figure out.
I'd be curious.
Yeah.
There's a couple of more that occur to me.
But the news stories are there online. Anyone here can do research on this, you know. I mean, I'm not going to be able to find something online that you wouldn't be able to find online too. So just look for stories about, you know, fire in the North Tower. It was, as I recall, February of 1975. Go ahead.
And you showed a picture, which I had not seen before, of dump trucks at the World Trade Center.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to admit, they looked a great deal like consistent material like dirt.
Yeah.
But wouldn't we then find, you know, 20 or 50 city workers saying, yeah, I was delivering dirt to the World Trade Center?
Well, I'll tell you how elaborate they were about this. They had GPSs on all these trucks. And when they were hauling stuff out, they knew exactly where every one of those trucks was at every minute. And some guy actually took some kind of break. I don't know if he went to a restaurant or went to see a girlfriend, but that guy got fired. There was a real tight lid kept on this, Bob. And it's the kind of thing you would expect if something was going on that they did not want the public to learn about. This whole business about the dirt is very peculiar. Because it's so utterly inconsistent with the official story, but seems to be consistent with some unconventional mode of demolition, something involving some kind of nukes, and there are reports of elevated tritium and deuterium. And this is a matter that I'm still investigating because we still don't know how this was done. Judy Wood has offered the idea that some kind of demolecularization process was taking place. I'll tell you this, they rebuilt Building 7 just so fast you can't believe it. But the Twin Towers, those locations, somehow resisted rebuilding. It's like there were residual effects that were decaying, whatever they were trying to construct. And it's still a matter that, you know, they haven't really gotten very far on rebuilding what's now going to be called, I guess, the Freedom Tower. So something real strange going on there. We have not figured out what happened. I will say this, too, by an aside, because I just published this today. In the last couple of days on Veterans Today, I have 3 pieces that you might like to take a look at that are very consistent with what I've been telling you here about the plane crashes. But for a last year, I've been involved in a research group looking into this idea that nanothermite was used to destroy the buildings. Stephen Jones, who I invited to be my co-chair when I founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth, and I we parted ways at the end of 2006. Over this issue by and large, because he was fixated on thermate, nanothermate. I asked him in June of 2006 at the American Scholars Conference in Los Angeles whether nanothermite could be responsible for the destruction of the Twin Towers, the pulverization of the concrete, the destruction of the steel, and he said to me, yes, it was, that it could do that. But now I've done all this research with a chemical engineer who works for NASA. He's an excellent guy. His name is T. Mark Hightower. And he has gone into the technical literature in a manner that is far beyond my competence and discovered that all these claims are false. That there's a principle in material science that in order to destroy a material, you have to have a destructive force that operates faster than the speed of sound in that material. In concrete, the speed of sound in concrete is 3,200 meters per second. In steel, it's 6,100 meters per second. The ignition or demolition rate or speed of thermite is 895 meters per second, which means there's no possibility that this nanothermite could have been responsible for the destruction of the Twin Towers. So this whole story, which has assumed the character of a dogma in the 9/11 community is untrue. And therefore I published an article entitled, "Is 9/11 Truth Based Upon a False Theory?" If I'm going to fault the government for its phony theories, which I have been doing my best to demolish as thoroughly as they can be demolished, I'm certainly not going to be able to turn around and endorse a phony story about how it was done when it turns out to be provably false. And I'm just sorry to say that there's some of the most prominent names in the 9/11 community, including Steve Jones and Kevin Ryan and even Niels Harrit, who published this paper which received such sensational attention, even though the editor-in-chief of the journal resigned because she thought it wasn't appropriate to be published in the journal. I wrote her to ask because of that, whether that was qualitative or because of the subject matter, and she did not write back to me, but it's there. I can't endorse a false theory coming from the 9/11 movement any more than I can a false theory coming from the government. So I say, that's kind of depressing, but it's also liberating. It's depressing because we were sold a bill of goods that's now provably false, but it's also emancipating because it allows us to look at other more promising theories like the possibility of mini nukes, the elevated deuterium and tritium and so forth, or some kind of directed energy. We don't know how it was done, but I think we can have an easier way now to figure out how it was done. Bob, I know.
Last question, because I think there's others that should be asking. I hadn't read about or heard about the Mossad agents doing the filming of the thing and then back on TV in Israel. But if they were Mossad agents, one suspects they're very well trained, and I can't imagine why they would end up on TV bragging about it.
There's a certain arrogance here. I mean, and look at the arrogance of the Bush-Cheney administration. They held out for 441 days to even have a commission appointed to investigate 9/11. They gave it paltry funding. They refused to testify under oath. They insisted they go in together so that Cheney could keep Bush from saying something stupid. And, it's just astounding. Look, Bob, it's not just that these guys were involved. There were some 200 Mossad agents that came into the country posing as art students who were tracking the alleged hijackers. And I'm telling you, they were doing that so they would know where they were at all times. The latest report I have is that convenient list of 19 Islamic terrorists that was allegedly found in the luggage of Mohammed Atta, and this is one of the great absurdities of the entire 9/11 story from the government. I mean, can you imagine you're going to do this traumatic suicide bombing and you're going to create a list of your 19 co-conspirators? I mean, this is ludicrous. Apparently that was given to the FBI by Israel, by the Israeli government. And they had 200 art students they were classified as who were tracking these guys who were going to strip shows, eating, food that is non-Islamic, drinking, all these kinds of things. I'll tell you a wonderful story. When I had my students here at UMD, in critical thinking class, for example, we talk about the different religions, say, and I'd explain that in Islam, there's an absolute prohibition against the consumption of alcoholic beverages, and there's no sex outside of marriage. I noticed a substantial diminution in enthusiasm for conversion to Islam. Bob, I don't know if I got your final question. I think you had another one you want to ask, so if you want to, I didn't mean to cut you off. If anyone else, please go ahead.
I am a retired construction iron worker, and I spent most of my life working on the construction of buildings with steel columns. And I know for a fact that fuel oil, gasoline, kerosene, and so on cannot soften iron in that short a time. It cannot burn it. The only way steel columns and beams can be cut is with acetylene torch. And it's a slow, skillful process. And my question is this. Why aren't I will go back a little bit. There must have been a lot of planning by architects, engineers, and then you have construction contractors. Why aren't they coming forward to question this? Because they should know they planned it. And why is not there are iron workers in the local of New York City Why aren't they coming out to question?
Yeah, your point's impeccable. Of course, steel is made of a combination of iron and carbon. So that's why the question about iron is significant. There is an organization called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, the chairman of which is Richard Gage. He's been traveling all over the country. He's been giving lots of discussions about the non-collapse of the Twin Towers, how it was demolished. He's been promoting the nanothermite story, which is one of the reasons why I've been so concerned that the 9/11 movement was being led down a primrose path. Suppose you actually had the bona fide culprits, the real perps. You took them into court and you claim they did this using nanothermite, and then someone observes, well, nanothermite only has a demolition rate of 895 meters per second, and to destroy concrete, you'd have to have a demolition rate of 3,200 meters per second, to steel 6,100 meters per second. The case would be thrown out of court, and because of double jeopardy, they might not even be able to be tried again. So I've been very concerned that this false belief about nanothermite is being promoted. Now, the question has a further ramification. I don't understand why faculty all over the country aren't up in arms. I actually suggested at one time, and David Ray Griffin wanted me to moderate this, and I wish he hadn't. I said, the great universities of the world should go in collaboration with the great newspapers of the world to study the scientific aspects of 9/11. And it was a big part of one of the very first press releases I wrote for scholars. I said, New York Times, for example, could collaborate with Columbia University to determine whether the official story is true or false. And David Ray Griffin thought I should use the carrot rather than the stick. Well, you know, I unfortunately acceded and toned down that part of that press release, but I think it was one of the best ideas I ever had about 9/11, and I regret very much doing that. David Ray Griffin has published 10 books about 9/11, and they're wonderful books, but he has been completely taken in by this nanothermite myth. And I'm sorry to say, it is a myth. The nanothermite myth is just as much a myth as what Philip Zelikow gave us about 9/11, and it's tragic. I mean, even Kevin Ryan, this Mark Hightower, was so convinced about his research on 9/11, you know, on nanothermite, and I agreed with him completely, that he issued his nanothermite challenge, which was if anyone could find any published studies that showed that the demolition rate of a nanothermite was 1,000 meters a second faster than, for each 1,000 meters faster than he was claiming, the 895, he'd give him $100 up to $1,000. The day of the expiration of the nanothermite challenge, Kevin Ryan, and this is the guy, by the way, who worked for Underwriters Laboratory and who blew the whistle and exposed how they had given this certification of 2,000 degrees for 3 or 4 hours. UL didn't just come out and volunteer that information. Kevin Ryan made it public, and then he was fired for having done that. So this is a guy I admired greatly. He's a huge guy. I mean, he's like 6'7" or something, a really big guy. I met him in Chicago at the first conference on 9/11, and at that time he was congratulating me for my good work. But since I become a critic of this thermite stuff, you see, I'm no longer, you know, on his, well, let's say I'm on a different list. And he published in 9/11 Blogger, which used to be very good until it started to enforce standards of censorship and wouldn't allow people like me even post on 9/11 Blogger. I mean, when I first got scholars going, A.K. Doody was astonished when I told him that 9/11 scholars for 9/11 Truth was getting more hits than 9/11 Blogger, because it was widely believed that Blogger was the central site for 9/11 research. The scholars at that point actually had transcended it and was the centerpiece of the movement for about 1 year, from about 2005 to 2006. Now there's been all this fragmentation in the sense of new societies, which I personally think is a good thing. So Steve Jones founded a new group with Kevin Ryan and others. Then there's architects and engineers, there's law enforcement officials, there's firefighters for 9/11 Truth, there's pilots for 9/11 Truth. You name. Gary Coles is a part of medical for experts for 9/11 Truth, and he's been very active here in the community and been giving wonderful support to 9/11 research. So it just goes on and on and on, you know. So there are a lot of architects and engineers, but there are a whole lot of others on faculty and in industry who are silent, and I believe this has a lot to do with government funding, that their contracts come from the government, they're worried about them being cut off. if they speak up about it. Even Mark Hightower went to great lengths to explain that this research had nothing to do with NASA, even though he's been working for NASA for 21 years. But it had to do with his own independent exercise of his constitutional right to inquire. Speak.
Medical professionals.
Medical professionals. Thank you, Gary. Oh, right here.
Really great to have affirmation for what some of us have been saying. At the very least, it's ruined this events. I'm ashamed, however, of so many of my colleagues in the Christian church, even Veterans for Peace and North Atlantic War Coalition don't want to touch this subject somehow. And I think it's big. Right now, we can't get them to come to see the truth while they want to legalize. So.
Yeah, it's very disturbing. I mean, let me tell you how bad it gets. I mean, right here at UMD. I submitted a proposal. There's a retirement program. You can actually get some funding for a project if you're a retired faculty here. So I said, well, I want to edit a second book on 9/11, right? So I said, well, I'm going to try this. So I put together a proposal for a second book on 9/11. I'm going to go forward with it regardless of this particular story I'm telling you. But I had to have, as a part of my proposal, I had to have some, department or unit say they would administer the grant. And the chair of my own Department of Philosophy told me that they didn't believe that the money should be spent to investigate 9/11. This is a philosophy department. Philosophy departments historically have stood for freedom of inquiry, freedom of thought, open debate about any issue. But he said they thought it would be a waste of money. He hadn't even read the proposal. He had not even read the proposal. The dean, however, the new dean of the College of Liberal Arts, Susan May here, said she would support it. So the guy, the historian who was the head of the committee that was selecting the proposal said, no, he didn't like this proposal. I had very difficult to crack, the mindset. It involves this cognitive dissonance. You don't want to believe your government could kill 3,000 of your fellow citizens to promote a political agenda. After all, the use of violence and threats of violence to instill fear into a population, to subject them to manipulation for political purposes is a classic definition of terrorism, which means that if our results are correct, then the American government has been practicing terrorism on the American people. And a lot of faculty and administrators don't want to go there. They're just not willing. Even though I was giving, a lot of arguments very similar to the arguments I'm giving you here. Go ahead, Gary. You wanted to. Oh, here's the other thing. So I'm going to speak here at UMD, right? And Mel has gone to all this trouble to set it up. And all of a sudden, a week before I'm supposed to speak, he's hit with a requirement for a $1 million liability policy for Jim Fetzer to come to UMD, where he had spoken many times, and just a few years ago spoke here at the invitation of the student government, and they gave me a $1,000 honorarium. The room was absolutely packed. It was the same room, as I recall. We had people sitting in the aisles, okay? And afterwards, the guy from the student government who had given me the honorarium said that was the most courageous speech he ever heard, right? So I'm here in the same university, even in the same room, and now they're charging, they want us to have a $1 million liability policy. Right, my dad would be impressed. It's something that was so inflammatory or so significant, they need a $1 million liability policy. So we tried, so I solicited the department and the dean and the vice chancellor, Vince Magnuson. And Vince and I go back. I mean, we haven't always been on the same side, but we go back a long way. And I thought it would be a nice opportunity of Vince to make a magnanimous gesture by co-sponsoring, because if we had a university co-sponsor, we didn't have to worry about the $1 million liability policy. And Susan, the dean, wrote me and said that the university decided it wasn't going to co-sponsor the event, but that if we had a problem, meeting that condition, she was sure we could find another venue in Duluth that would be happy to host us. I mean, my opinion is this is something, not to make up a phrase, but this is something called chicken shit. Gary, go. We finally got, by the way, we were finally salvaged by Mel. What's the name of the Itasca Progressive Caucus? The Itasca Progressive Caucus. we're willing to extend the protection of $1 million liability policy for me to speak here to you tonight.
And so if we have some fist fights tonight, it's covered. Anyway, for those of us who want to keep in contact, it's easy for people to leave and then you never get to know each other or never have another chance to make some networking. There are lists back there. You can put your name and your email address, and we'll kind of let people know when the next event is or whatever. So, but my question, I guess, is what can we do to convince our families who don't want to touch this, or our neighbors who don't want to touch this, relatives, church members, etc. I should mention that I several times invited the journalists of the Duluth News Tribune and the budgeteer to show up, and I don't think anybody...
I think you got to do it in a very subtle way, Gary. It's such a touchy issue. You just say, here's something I don't understand. If this plane crashed at the Pentagon, why isn't there any debris? The Pentagon showed us this picture of the plane, but it's not the size of a Boeing 757. Why is that? Here's the lawn. Why is the lawn free from debris? If you can find something that can hook them on one of the anomalies, one of the subtle points in the evidence that refutes the official account, then you can do it. But I'm telling you, it's tricky because you're dealing with the desire not to believe that your government is capable of doing things that the government is manifestly capable of doing and has done. So there we are, please.
Yes, you said that the Israeli Secret Service and Mossad was in cahoots, so to speak, with the American government to bring about this situation. What was in it for Israel for them to do that? Because if we look at the results of what they've gleaned, we see that the current president, our president, who claims they found Osama bin Laden, or captured him, that he is supporting the Palestinian state, and he is also supporting the division of Jerusalem, which is totally against the wishes of the Israeli government. So I find it odd, inconsistent, that the Israeli government would, either the president absolutely betrayed them, or there's something that's not quite adding up. And if you go according to Occam's razor, the simplest and most obvious solution is the first one to go by, that it just doesn't add up.
Well, as a philosopher of science, I would observe, I publish on this, Occam's razor, the preference for the simplest explanation is only provided it can account for all the available evidence. And the simplest theory is not necessarily one that accounts for all the available evidence. Look at the evidence I'm giving you here. Would the simplest theory be 19 Islamic terrorists who, hijacked 4 planes and committed these atrocities under the control of a guy in Afghanistan? That's probably the simplest theory, but it's certainly inconsistent with the evidence and has been falsified. Now, Barack Obama is not George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. This happened in the Bush-Cheney administration. It was riddled with neocons. You take a look. Many of these guys had joint U.S.-Israeli citizenship. Dov Zakheim, who was the controller of the Pentagon when it lost $2.3 trillion, is a joint U.S.-Israeli citizen. He pioneered a lot of the secret techniques that are used in areas like this, including remote control aircraft, which led some to speculate that maybe the planes were remotely controlled. But the points I've made here show it can't be any real plane. I do think they contemplated remote control planes, but they couldn't get them inside the building. You can only get inside the building with a fake plane. And whether it was done with computer-generated images or some kind of a video composite or even a hologram, which is the most interesting claim I've heard, for the reason that you do have witnesses who claim to have seen a plane, though they're all over the place, that a fellow named Andrew Johnson, who went through the 500 witness reports collated by the New York Times and found some saw no plane, some saw a small plane, a big plane, a military plane. The number who saw a United Airlines plane fly into the South Tower was the same as the number who saw a missile fired from the Woolworth building into the North Tower, namely 1. So, the witnesses are all over the place. But if you take seriously that witnesses saw something that looked like a plane, then since it can't be a real plane, it cannot be a real plane, It has to be a fake plane. And if it's a fake plane, then what could be a fake plane? A sophisticated hologram. And John Lear has observed too that the plane you see in this video is not only flying at an impossible speed, making an impossible entry. Entering the building, its whole length, the same number of frames it passes through air, but it has no strobe lights. Okay? Now, real commercial carrier has to have these strobe lights. There are no strobe lights on Flight 175. And of course, the Flight 11, you can't even see that it's what it actually is supposed to be. So my answer to you is this. Yeah, Obama has antagonized him, and it's one of the few areas where I think that Obama, has done something close to what I expected of Obama. I gave this guy $100 5 different times, and it wasn't the same $100. And I feel he did none of the things I expected. I thought he'd repeal the Patriot Act, he'd rescind the Military Commissions Act, he'd close Guantanamo, bring our forces back from Iraq and from Afghanistan. The next thing I know, he's saying 33,000 more troops to Afghanistan. Well, that is all consistent with, an Israeli foreign policy. I mean, look, I'm not making this up. There are expert scholars who do this research who have demonstrated as Israel controls America's foreign policy. So I mean, if you want to dispute that, you don't want to argue with me. You want to go to the research. It's out there, and it's very well known. Just go do a Google.
Did we betray then Israel then? If they're controlling us, then if Israel's controlling us, why would we be supporting the division of Jerusalem, which is against them, and a Palestinian state, which is against them? No, you're not making sense.
Control isn't complete.
It's inconsistent.
Obama has done a few things that are good things.
And I want to warn, I want to say here too, that this always scapegoating of Israel beyond reason is an old halt, it is not a good thing.
Look,
yes.
I published an article. Let me
But you didn't really answer my question.
Let me just rebut this right off the bat. I spoke from the Capitol of the United States on the 15th of April 2008 at the Ron Paul Freedom Rally. I gave a presentation that's subsequently been published as the 9/11 and the Neocon Agenda, where I laid out the background about this. Many experts have substantiated the role of the Mossad in Israel in the events of 9/11. I published a subsequent article, Is 9/11 Research Anti-Semitic? And I explained how there's a complete misconception here. You got to distinguish between Zionism, which is a belief in the superiority of Israel and its entitlement to the lands of Palestine, versus being anti-Semitic, which is to discount a person's position or views on the grounds of their religious orientation or origin. I am absolutely not anti-Semitic. I am absolutely anti-Zionist. I didn't even know what Zionism was until a couple of years ago when I began looking into the charges that Zionism was at fault. One of a book I actually I showed briefly but didn't talk about here is Stranger Than Fiction. This is a history of the origin of Zionism. I actually featured the author on my radio show. I read some chapters from it that would fit into 2 hours. I've had others on. There's a book called Guilt by Association by a fellow named Gates that's quite brilliant about recent evolution of Zionism. Zionism is pernicious. I reject Zionism categorically, and it is completely separate from anti-Semitism. Criticism of the government of Israel or the actions of the government of Israel is perfectly legitimate, and it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Anyone who believes the Israeli government is entitled to treat Palestinians like dirt, has got to recognize that there's something grossly wrong here.
My dear professor, that is not exactly what is happening, and that is indeed not fact. The Palestinians were ejected from every state around them by their own brothers, the Arab brothers, for being troublemakers.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, if you have a question about 9/11, let's return to 9/11. Do you have a question about 9/11?
I just want to say that you have to be careful the way you word things, and that this hellfire thing about Zionism also can be easily misconstrued by a lot of people who don't have deep knowledge about the subject you're talking about. It's very dangerous.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's explosive.
As I say, it wasn't even a concept in my vocabulary a few years ago, and I began interviewing experts who knew much more about it.
You can easily turn Zionism into anti-Semitism, and especially in a group that is not deeply familiar with the topics of what you're talking about, and that is exactly what happens.
Well, that's why
I'm
suggesting reading is 9/11 research anti-Semitic. It clearly
I can just
is
say
not.
that on the surface you're incongruent as far as concerns the fact that if if one tiny branch or one element, this is the way it is in every country, an element, it still doesn't make any sense on the surface as to why the president would have betrayed Israel, then is what you're suggesting, if they were in cahoots with them to set 9/11.
Listen, you're confusing administrations. Why wouldn't it be more obvious when you're committing a simple blunder of confounding the Bush-Cheney administration with the Obama-Biden administration? I mean, what could be more obvious? Barack Obama is not a clone of W. And the neocons, I'm happy to say, don't seem to have as much influence in this administration as they did in the last. But I was very troubled when he kept the same Secretary of Defense and the same Director of the FBI, because Robert Mueller knows a whole lot about 9/11, and that the whole story we've been told is rubbish. Please, go ahead.
On 9/11, the Citgo station across from the Pentagon had video surveillance that was confiscated by the FBI. Have they ever turned up those videos?
No. Those are among the 80. I mean, it's amazing. The FBI was out within 15 minutes to collect all these security videos. There are more than 80 of them, and the Pentagon released exactly 3, which showed no more than those 5 frames as far as the alleged destruction. And I've already pointed out the anomalies of the fireball compared to what happened in New York. I mean, they can't both be authentic, but they can both be faked, and that's what appears to be the case.
Now, what's the defense system if a plane gets too close to the Pentagon? What is their defense system?
Well, I'm glad you raised that. Oh, they have anti-aircraft. This is like the most heavily defended building in the world. They have anti-aircraft missiles and all that. It's well known. And what's very interesting about it is unless a plane approaching the Pentagon had a military transponder that identified itself as a friendly aircraft, it could not have got anywhere near the building.
Not close to it.
Yeah, this whole thing was just so fraudulent from beginning to end. I mean, it's embarrassing once you figured out to realize that you were actually even sucker enough to believe any of it.
Have you ever read the story on the USS Liberty?
Yes, I have. I have indeed. In fact, the fellow Gates that has this book about guilt by association was a co-author. I read extensively from that on my radio show too. And this, of course, was the attack on a military intelligence ship by Israel during the 7 Days War. They wanted to blame it on Egypt and draw the United States into it. The admiral in the fleet there, when learned about it, sent American fighter aircraft to intercept. The Israelis repeatedly strafed the ship, even the sailors in lifeboats, which is an international crime under the Geneva Conventions. Lyndon Johnson, to my utter astonishment, called the planes back and allowed Israel off the hook. But if you want to learn of a stunning example, I mean, anyone who thinks that Israel is our friend, or read about the USS Liberty, this particular book is called What I Saw That Day. You can find it online at Amazon. I'm telling you, we've been sold a bill of goods. I'm really sorry to say Israel is not our friend. Israel is out for what benefits Israel, and that does not coincide with the best interests of the United States. Before 9/11, America didn't have an enemy in the Middle East. After 9/11 now, Israel and the United States are among the most despised and reviled countries in the world. I'm really sorry this is the case. I didn't grow up that way. I grew up believing that Israel was a wonderful country and a great thing and all that, but it's just not true, I'm sorry to say. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm not going to yell at you. I'm excited to see a lot of people from the reader in this room. Really excited. But I was wondering, you mentioned that you had also done some research on the death of Paul Wellstone.
Yeah.
And in all the different kind of diagrams, circles with all this stuff. Did you ever find any correlation between Wellstone and where he stood on 9/11 and his death?
Oh, Dick Cheney warned Paul Wellstone shortly before his death that if he opposed the administration on Iraq, that there would be severe ramifications for him personally and for the state of Minnesota. And he appears to have followed through on that. I've done quite a lot. Bob Boone was a publisher. Well, I published 10 columns about Wellstone's death in the Reader. I would eventually co-author a book with a Native American scholar from northern Arizona by the name of Don Four Arrows Jacobs. Our research led in the direction of the use of a directed energy weapon that took out all the computerized system aboard the plane, its navigation system, its communication system, the loud stall warning device, and flipped the solenoids, these switches that control the props, on idle, so the plane was destined to crash. We have a supervisor of schools from the Evelyn, Virginia area who heard what he thought were gunshots in the plane. I'm convinced it was these computerized systems that were blowing up in the plane systematically because of the directed energy weapon. It's supported also by this Paul Ongaro's odd anomalous phone call. He got a call when he was right in the vicinity. He was just within 2 miles of the airport, and it was a whirling, warbling sound where John Costello, who is a PhD in electromagnetism, who I actually flew up to do further research even after publishing the book with 4 arrows, said had to be of human source because of its periodicity, you know, it's a repeating sound and so forth. We found reports of garage doors opened there. This would be another residual effect of a directed, you know, of an electronic directed energy field you actually create. What you want to get then is get the plane to fly into the field, and that's a bit complicated, but they appear to have actually distorted the GPS system. This is absolutely stunning, and it's the only case I know of where this appears to have happened. I had because it was flying, you know, 2 miles south of the airport along an azimuth where they seemed comfortable or seemed to know, you know, not know they were in trouble. I was contacted by a pilot who was flying into the Waukegan airport, and it was like a mirror image, and he said he came out of the clouds and found he was off course by approximately the same distortion, that he had a GPS degrade light he'd never seen before. When he landed at the airport, he realized he landed at the same time the Wellstone plane was crashing, and it appears to have been a temporary aberration where the military manipulated the GPS to get the plane to fly into this electromagnetic field so that its systems would all fall apart. If you want to pursue this, go to my website, assassinationscience.com, and if you scroll to the bottom of the menu bar, there's a 1-hour flash lecture on Wellstone that was perfect up to that time. You got every slide in place, everything I said exactly right, and then I did this additional research, bringing Costello up from Australia. We were tromping around the Wellstone crash site, picking up charred pieces of debris in 35 below zero weather. We went through the 2,500 pages of documents that were providing support for the 80-page NTSB study. And we discovered an additional anomaly that supported the conclusion that it was a directed energy weapon, which is that a meteorological phenomenon at the level where ice forms. The meteorologists reported that there was a level of melted ice above the crash site. That couldn't be from the fire because the heat from the fire drops off with an inverse square law. You don't have to be very far away from a fire to it not be bothering you. So it obviously didn't affect this level in the atmosphere. But I must tell you that even Michael Rupert in his book Crossing the Rubicon, which is all about 9/11, it's not a scientific study, but it's putting together all the political pieces and arrives at the same conclusion I have, that Dick Cheney was in charge of the operation here. Norman Mineta was witnessing a part of it. He also concluded that it was the use of a directed energy weapon, and he had an inside source, a guy who actually still is involved in assassinations for the CIA, who told him that it had been an inside job and that you could expect there to be other strategic accidents like this in the future. A single stroke, they removed the foremost critic of their policy toward Iraq, the foremost critic of the Bush-Cheney programs in general, and they gave control of the Senate, turned over to the Republicans when you combine the loss of Max Cleland in Georgia, which was very clearly through the manipulation of electronic voting machines, where all these machines were reporting the same number. It was like 18181. So it was real clear that there was something going on. Very funny. Georgians tend to elect senators and governors and re-elect them over and over. And yet here you have this very strange turnover. I mean, this Max Cleland is a multiple amputee, you know, from the war. He's a war hero. He's a great guy. And he resigned from the 9/11 Commission because he saw it was going to be a whitewash, by the way. But there's a wonderful, so this study that John and I did is found on Assassination Science under the heading, The NTSB Failed Wellstone. Now, this is only a couple of pages long. It's got 6 photographs from the crash site, and it'll just give you the chills when you see how there was an intense fire that burned for 7 hours that they could not extinguish. And I'm convinced that was to destroy all these mechanisms that had been blown up so there'd be no evidence for it. So it's very clever. I don't know quite how it was done, but it was a weird fire. And in this paper, which is more than 4 or 5 pages, it has 115 footnotes. I think it's probably the most copiously documented short paper in history. So you go there and you look at those, you're going to understand what happened to Wellstone.
I want to chip in for just a second on that. What Jim isn't mentioning, and I'm not following or necessarily buying energy-related weapons with Wellstone, but back when I was working with Jim on the story as it happened, we both found out that the Minneapolis FBI was the first FBI team on the site, and they would have had to leave Minneapolis at 9:30 for a 10:30 plane crash to get there by 11:30. And Duluth's and Bemidji's FBI office got there later. Another very strange thing in the real bread and butter sense is that the FBI eventually interviewed the owner of the aircraft in Minneapolis 2 days after the event, or the day after the event, where for sure they would have asked if there was a black box. The owner of the airplane would have either said, yes, there's a black box, or no, there's not a black box. 2 days following, they kept searching for the black box and then announced that there wasn't one. And that has no logical answer.
Just to add a couple of comments about what Bob has just said. The FBI was there by noon. Our own sheriff of the county verified these were people he knew personally. He showed up there at 1:30 and he was told by one of them they'd been there since noon. I verified it with the airport manager who had first located the crash site. It wasn't even reported. He didn't even locate the crash site until 11 a.m. And yet these FBI guys were there on the scene by noon, and FBI spokesman would later say they hadn't shown up until 3:30, but that's false. And as Bob is implying, in order for them to have been here at the crash site at Evelyn, Virginia, they had to, when they were flying from St. Paul to Duluth and then renting cars, they had to take off at the same time the senator's plane was taking off, which displays a remarkable kind of foreknowledge on the part of the FBI. John Costello has a PhD in electromagnetism. My own PhD is in the history and the philosophy of science. We were very thoroughgoing about this. There's a section in the book about Wellstone's death about directed energy weapons. But Bob is a wonderful guy, but I dare say that what John and I say about directed energy weapons is more reliable than Bob's skepticism, though I value skepticism, okay? And I respect his right to have a divergent point of view. But I tell you, this is good. The evidence we have here isn't explainable any other way. So go there, go to assassinationscience.com, scroll down the menu bar, look at the Wellstone lecture, then look at the NTSB failed Wellstone. And then if you want, look at Michael Rupert's book where he's got an insider explaining that this was an inside job. I was a huge fan of Paul Wellstone.
I was a
Great
huge
boss.
fan, and I believe that they took him out because he opposed the transport of nuclear waste over state boundaries.
Oh, I think he was also involved in this, and also the asbestos case involving the Grace Company. So you're right, they had multiple reasons. Hey, I want to thank you all for coming. It's been wonderful to have you here. Thanks.